Chapter 31 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Rupture. It was on the 28th day of November, 1881, that he landed in Metlakahtla. The steamer on which he came brought with it a great many tons of freight for him, and stayed several hours in the harbor discharging its cargo. Hardly had Mr. Duncan turned the key in the door of his office before Bishop Ridley rushed in, and in an excited tone asked him if he was going to England to meet the committee. Mr. Duncan calmly informed him that he was not, just at present, but that if the committee, after receiving his communication sent them some time ago, were of the opinion that his presence in England was desirable, he would go as soon as it was possible for him to do so, without interfering with his plans absolutely necessary for promoting the welfare of Metlakahtla. "There," said the bishop, with a malicious gleam in his eyes, as he thrust at Mr. Duncan with as much self-satisfaction as if he had been dealing the last deadly blow to a mortal enemy, a sealed envelope, and then, as Mr. Duncan opened it and read it, "I guess I am master now." "Well, Bishop, have you not acted a little prematurely? Have I refused to go home? But all the same, I thank you for this. It clarifies the situation considerably." This was the letter handed to Mr. Duncan by the bishop. Church Missionary Society, Salisbury Square, London, E.C., September 29th, 1881. To Mr. W. Duncan. Dear Brother Duncan, the envelope containing this letter is placed in the hands of the Bishop of Caledonia, with a request that he will hand it to you only in the event of your refusing to come home to confer with the committee, and continuing your opposition to the spiritual work of the mission being carried on in accord with the principles of the Church of England, as accepted by this society. With the deepest pain and sorrow, the committee has come to the conclusion that in such a contingency they have no course to pursue but to take the necessary steps for dissolving your connection with the society. We feel that we need hardly assure you that the committee have followed with admiration and thankfulness the history of the development of Metlakahtla under your hands, the devotion, resolution, and energy with which you have stuck to the work, and the wonderful influence you have been permitted to exercise over the Indian mind are by no means forgotten, and the memory of them must live so long as the history of the mission survives, whatever be its future. But the committee feels that they have paramount duties to fulfill, both towards the native church, built up through the agency of this society, and also towards the members of the society at home. We seek the extension of the kingdom of our dear Lord and Savior, and the principles that actuate the society are well known. Our allegiance to our Lord forbids us to go from these principles. It is now our painful duty to request you to arrange as soon as possible for the handing over to the Bishop of Caledonia the charge of our mission. We have asked him, and have no doubt that he will accede to our request, to act for us temporarily, and to assume the charge of the mission. We cannot tell whether this decision of the committee will bring you home to England, but whether by letter or by verbal communication, we shall be thankful to enter into communication with you regarding a final grant. Footnote. One cannot be surprised at the poor English of the committee at a moment when they dared to hold out to Mr. Duncan the promise of a money bribe if he would only play the traitor to his Indians and give them up. End footnote. We cannot but repeat the expression of the deepest sorrow with which we have to convey to you a decision which has cost the committee much pain. God grant that all may be overruled for good and the advance of His kingdom, and may His blessing and guidance ever rest on you. We remain, dear Brother Duncan, yours very faithfully in the Lord, Fred E. Wigram, W. Gray, Secretaries. In this cruel, heartless, unchristian way was then to be rung down the curtain over one of the most wonderful works accomplished by one man in the world's history of missions. The Church, not Christ, was to rule Metlakahtla. When one remembers that this letter bore the same date as the letter received by Mr. Duncan in Victoria, simply inviting, not summoning him to London for conference, and that in that letter no hint even was given of the intention of the committee to sever the relations if he did not come home, one will readily admit that the course of double-dealing and underhandedness of the Bishop of Caledonia had manifestly been adopted by the committee, if not by the society as well. It was, perhaps, only meet that the bishop should not even respect the conditions imposed by the committee, before severing, as far as in the power of the society lay, Mr. Duncan's connection with his life work at Metlakahtla, which well might have deserved greater consideration and gratitude, but should deliver the letter to Mr. Duncan, though he, to the bishop's knowledge, never had refused to go home to England. The bishop, undoubtedly fearful of the consequences of this overreaching, unless he could be present in person and excuse it, did not choose to comply with the committee's request to take charge of the mission, but deputized Mr. Collison to act as the agent of the society, and precipitatedly fled to England on the same steamer on which Mr. Duncan had arrived at Metlakahtla. One of the Indians, seeing him leave on the steamer the bishop had expected Mr. Duncan to take out of Metlakahtla, cried after him as he left the beach, "Haman was hanged on his own gallows, was he not?" Immediately upon receiving this inconsiderate dismissal from his life work in connection with the society, Mr. Duncan prepared to leave and vacate the mission house. When what had transpired had spread like prairie fire in the village, one of the Indian houses was at once set aside for him, and hundreds of loving hands were ready to carry his furniture and his books to the new quarters. There was great excitement, and the feeling at the outrageous conduct of the society and the bishop ran high. But be it said to the credit of the Indians, there was no breach of the peace. That same evening, a meeting was held, at which the Indians unanimously passed a resolution, requesting Mr. Duncan to remain as their preacher and teacher. But he refused to give them an answer then, as they were excited and many of the people were away. The same answer he gave to another resolution of similar import, adopted at a second meeting held shortly afterwards. Before deciding, he wanted to be sure that all the people were with him, and that their action was not taken in haste and excitement, which they might rue thereafter. The church had not been opened from the time of his dismissal till about Christmas time, when everybody was back in the village. The elders then called a meeting in the church for discussion on the action of the society. All the natives came out, sick and well, young and old. Even the cripples humped along as fast as they could. Only Mr. Duncan was absent. He did not want to influence them by his presence. The meeting did not last long. These people intuitively felt what he had done for them, and what he had been to them. They knew that they owed him all that they now prized: happy homes, loving families, peace, order, civilization, and most of all, a sure hope of heaven, and they needed no long harangues in order to know what to do. A few speeches were made, short, to the point, and full of feeling. Every heart beat in unison. And when one of the elders put the question to them, "Will you have the bishop or Shimauget for your leader?" Footnote: the chief, the name which all of them had given to Duncan for years. Every child in the village knew who Shimauget was. There was only one of that name in the village. End footnote. Even the holy place where they were, and their great respect for it, could not restrain a shout of "Shimauget," which almost shook the solid walls. And when a show of hands was called for, every hand in the house was raised for Mr. Duncan. Not one hand stirred for the bishop. Now Mr. Duncan was sent for. He came. The elders met him at the door and conducted him to a seat prepared for him at the head of the central aisle. One of the elders, George Usher, then approached, Bible in hand, and turning to the congregation said, "You are now asked to confirm with your own voices your action at the different meetings, and to say whether you wish Mr. Duncan to continue as your teacher and minister. All of you who so desire, show it now to Mr. Duncan by holding out your hand to him." Every hand in the audience went out to their beloved teacher. The elder turned to Mr. Duncan, placed the Bible in his hand, and said, "In behalf of this Christian congregation, I say to you, continue to be our minister, and go on teaching the Word of God, as you have done for the last 20 years. That is all the ordination as a minister of the gospel Mr. Duncan ever had. Methinks that perhaps it may suffice, even if it is not strictly according to ecclesiastical rules. Mr. Duncan, at least, considers it as sacred and holy as the laying on of hands would be by a bishop, who to such an extent forgot all mandates, not only of Christian priesthood, but of Christian manhood, that he did not hesitate to report to the Society in face of the foregoing facts, which constitute the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, the following misrepresentation. At one of the public meetings, Mr. Duncan put the question, "Will all on the Lord's side hold up their hands?" All held up their hands. Then he artfully said, "All on the bishop's side hold up their hands." Imagine their surprise at being thus ensnared. Several afterwards told me that they did not know that Mr. Duncan was the Lord, or they would not have raised their hands. Mr. Duncan briefly told them that he accepted their call, and assured them that he would remain as their teacher. The public services were now resumed, as well as the educational work in the school. Public improvements were again started. The work went on just as if there had been no rupture. And all Mr. Collison had to do, in order to earn his salary as the Society's agent, was to hold on to the keys of the mission house, which Mr. Duncan had turned over to him. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Serpent. In the meantime, there was quite a turmoil in the offices of the Church Missionary Society. Upon receipt of Mr. Duncan's long letter, he was informed that his explanations were satisfactory, and that he need not come to England. A letter was dispatched post-haste to the bishop instructing him not to deliver the enclosure. But too late. The enclosure had burned the bishop's hands till he had a chance to prematurely deliver it. And now came the news that the Indians were unanimously Duncan's Indians, and not the Society's. Not even one single solitary soul was there to whose spiritual wants the bishop and priest between them could have an opportunity to administer. Things were looking desperate indeed, and Bishop Ridley's ears must have tingled at what he heard of deprecation and disapproval of his hasty and ill-considered action. Finally, the bishop was told to hasten back to his distant see and move heaven and earth to get Mr. Duncan to come back into the fold with his mission and Indians, to make all possible promises and amends, to promise to move away from Metlakahtla if necessary. In short, Metlakahtla, the most precious crown jewel in the diadem of missionary achievements of the Church Missionary Society, lost by the indiscretion of the bishop, must now, at whatever cost, be recovered. The bishop came back. From Victoria he wrote Mr. Duncan, made him all kinds of propositions, some showing such a small contemptible mind that they could not help making a man of the sterling moral solidity of Mr. Duncan recoil, all in vain. Mr. Duncan's one answer was, "Too late," in a white community of 948 souls, for that was found to be the exact number of inhabitants at Metlakahtla. When, a few years later, a census was taken, it would not be expected that there could not be found some one who would not stand steadfast through all temptations, for at any length of time. Someone had said about the Tsimshians, "The Indians are no better than the white men." It was, therefore, not strange if the wonderful unanimity should, in time, be slightly broken. There were at Metlakahtla some people who had not lived such consistent lives as Christians should. They had been rebuked and reprimanded by Mr. Duncan, some of them publicly. A few of them were former chiefs who felt slighted. They were not made much of, and were, in fact, kept down. Their ambition had been wounded by the stern and determined man at the head of the colony, who knew no other merit than Christian virtue. It took but little inducement, small attentions, once in a while a little stirring in the hardly healed wound, which still smarted at times, to fan into flame the smouldering embers of dissatisfaction in these minds. So after 4 or 5 months, there was really a bishop's party at Metlakahtla, consisting of 4 or 5 adults, a majority of them so-called ex-chiefs, one of them at least an ex-convict and ticket of leave man, whose freedom from jail Mr. Duncan held in the hollow of his hand. I need not say that he never exercised the privilege. He would not be the man he is if he had. This was all the bishop wanted. He at last had acquired a party at Metlakahtla. On the very day of the rupture, he had approached Mr. Duncan's native teacher, David Leask, a sterling man and able Christian, who, till the day of his death, was a leader and a giant among his people, and offered him, as a bribe, a salary 1/3 larger than what he had, if he would forsake Mr. Duncan's leadership and accept work for the society under the bishop's orders. But Leask, poor as he was, spurned the tempter. On his return from England, the bishop was more successful in corrupting Mr. Duncan's white teacher, an Englishman who had been paid by Mr. Duncan out of his own private funds since the severance from the society. A female Indian assistant in the school did not have the power to resist, which David Leask had shown. When she also was tempted by the bishop to give up her school for a consideration, she deserted Mr. Duncan. Thus he thought to interfere with Mr. Duncan's schoolwork, and for a time really partly succeeded in this. His next scheme was to cripple the resources of the Metlakahtlans. Upon his return, he let it be assiduously understood that Mr. Duncan, a lone, insignificant man, never could successfully stand out against the society, which he was very careful to impress on their minds, had an annual income of over $1 million. Now the Indians were to feel the truth of this. The main income of the Metlakahtlans, enabling them to run their village, their school, and their church, as well as their other enterprises, came from the village store, which now had been organized on a cooperative plan. What does the bishop do but use the society's means in procuring a stock of goods, placing them for sale in the mission house, and selling them at cost price? Here again these splendid natives spurned the Serpent's bribe. Not one of them could be induced to leave their own store and buy goods at a much smaller price from the bishop. Oh, for such character among our white Christians! But the bishop's scheme did partially succeed. The neighboring tribes, whose trade constituted quite an item in the store's business, were to some extent tempted by the cunning bribe, in the nature of lower prices, and the village store lost quite a large proportion of its usual annual profits. But, thank God, the work was able to survive this blow also. As showing the bishop's haughty and arrogant disposition, I cite the following. After his return, the village council passed a resolution stating that it did not desire him to reside in the village. A letter containing this resolution was handed him by a native. He met him, took the letter, and without opening it, tore it into pieces, threw the fragments down, and trampled on them. When another man called with a second letter, he summoned him into the house, led the way to the fireplace, and threw the letter, unread, into the flames. How little he attempted to follow in the footsteps of the great Prince of Peace, whose servant he was supposed to be, is apparent from his own account, given in one of his reports. The medicine men at some mission station had disturbed him by their noise. He says, I stepped quickly up to the chief performer, took him by the shoulders, and before he could recover his self-possession, had him at the river brink, and assured him I would assist him further down next time. I wonder how many heathen Indians Mr. Duncan would have succeeded in converting at an earlier day if his method of procedure had been tainted with the bishop's muscular Christianity. The next move of the bishop was to call for a warship to come up to cow the Indians into submission to his lordship. The village store was built close to the mission house. No part of the society's funds had been used in its erection, but the bishop now had commenced to set up a claim that all that was built and started by Mr. Duncan from private contributions sent him was the society's property. Mr. Duncan, in 1885, stated that all such contributions, from the very first up to that date, amounted in all not to exceed $6,000. And as against this, he showed the cost and maintenance of the church, $12,959, establishing new industries, $11,426, village improvements, $3,040, and aid furnished the villagers in building their new houses $7,238, or a total expenditure of $34,663. The Indians, after having sought legal advice as to their rights in the premises, concluded to move the village store away from the undesirable proximity to the mission house, where the bishop resided. When they undertook to do this in a peaceable and quiet way, the bishop, who in the meantime had secured a magistrate's commission, got up and read the Riot Act to them, and immediately sent such an alarming report of the occurrence to Victoria that the authorities dared not wait till they could get hold of one of their own warships, but prevailed upon the United States government to send up the revenue cutter Oliver Wolcott with 2 magistrates. They at once, upon arrival, proceeded to investigate the so-called riot, but came to the conclusion that, on the Crown's own evidence, there had been no riot, and therefore dismissed the case. But before the revenue cutter arrived, further troubles had arisen. The Riot Act had been read by the bishop on the 30th of November, 1882. On the 18th of December, some one of the bishop's party had bought a drum from one of the Indians. As he was only part owner of the drum, with 6 or 7 others, they objected to the sale, and wanted Mr. Duncan's help to get it back. Mr. Duncan wrote to Mr. Collison, who refused to return it, and recommended a lawsuit. This, of course, was a small matter, but there was at the time so much bad blood in the camp that it did not require anything very great to create a row at Metlakahtla. Mr. Duncan, who did not want to exercise his powers of a magistrate, where he feared he might be prejudiced, sent the boys to a justice at Fort Simpson. But he, afraid of the bishop and the church, would not take up the case. Mr. Duncan and Mr. Collison then agreed to submit the matter to the bishop. He consented to act, but put the complainants off, perhaps because they were then in the midst of the Christmas festivities. It had been agreed that in the meantime the drum should not be used. But when a boy, contrary to the terms of this agreement, appeared on the street with a bone of contention, 2 of the part owners took the drum away from him. The bishop, who had not been in any hurry up to this time, now became very much aroused, and at once, on December 26th, issued his warrant for the 2 malfeasors. When brought before him, he, without any examination or hearing, on his own motion sent them to jail, there to remain until January 2nd. His excuse was that he wanted to have it determined as to the ownership of the drum before their hearing. The Indians, with a keen appreciation of the rights of an accused person to a speedy trial, at once called a meeting, without the knowledge or presence of Mr. Duncan. At this meeting it was voted to send a delegation to the bishop and request him to give the men an immediate trial. On proceeding to the bishop's house for this purpose, the delegation espied him coming up the street, and concluded to wait for him. One of the delegates, an old man, held up his hand as the bishop was nearing, and said, "Stop, bishop." The bishop pushed the old man aside, but one of the others, a young man, named Paul Legaic, the old chief's nephew, stepped out onto the road, and said, "No, bishop, don't do that. We want to talk to you. Why do you not try the 2 men before sending them to jail?" The bishop did not answer the question, but struck the young man a blow. He was a strong, powerful man, and could have annihilated the bishop, and did in fact lift his hand, when one of the others said, "No, don't strike back. Let him go." He followed the advice, and did not touch the bishop. One of the party, Robert Hewson, a humorous and gifted young man, now a highly respectable and influential citizen of New Metlakahtla, could not hold back an odious comparison. He stepped up to the bishop, and taking hold of his right hand, said, "Bishop, this hand baptize Indian, this hand fight Indian." The bishop, in his rage, gave him a violent blow on the chest, with such force as to throw him against another Indian, Jacob Bolton. That was more than Hewson could stand. He had a temper as well as the bishop, and he struck back once. At the same time, Jacob Bolton, whose nose was bleeding from the blow he had received when Hewson was pushed against him, started in earnest to give the bishop what he evidently was looking for. This was a signal for the whole crowd to take a hand, and the bishop would undoubtedly have fared very badly had it not been for Mr. Duncan's constables, who rushed in, pushed the crowd aside, and rescued the bishop, with the warning words to the men, "Christians must not fight. Better suffer wrong." "But the bishop struck first." "Well, let him do that, but not we. We must show him that we are Christians." The bishop now went to the mission house. The crowd started to the jail and released the prisoners. When the magistrates came up on the riot case, this whole drum trouble, with all its ramifications, was brought before them. Legale had, in vain, sought redress for the bishop's unprovoked assault upon him, as Mr. Duncan felt a delicacy about taking the matter up, and the Fort Simpson justice, to whom he sent the young man, was on too good terms with the bishop to take any steps against him. At the hearing before the magistrates, the bishop swore that he was set upon by a mob of 250 Indians. It was clearly proven, however, that there were not over 20 or 25 Indians present. He also swore that the old Indian had first struck him. This testimony he, however, at a subsequent hearing, changed to a greater consistency with the truth. At the hearing, the drum, the miserable cause of it all, was restored to its rightful owners. Robert Hewson was fined $10, as being guilty of a technical assault by taking hold of the bishop's hand when making his humorous remark, and another Indian was also fined a similar sum. The prisoners and their liberators were discharged, as their imprisonment by the bishop was held to be illegal. As might be expected, nothing was done to the bishop. He was a little too high up for that. These actions on the part of the bishop so irritated the Indians and created so much bad blood that after this it seemed that both parties just watched for an opportunity for getting at the other and stirring up trouble. Sometimes, undoubtedly, one side was in the wrong, sometimes the other. Most of the time, both of them. Small, insignificant trifles were made use of to try to down the other side, and every 6 months or so the bishop called for another warship and for the commissioners and magistrates. It had been calculated that his efforts to fight Mr. Duncan and the Indians of the mission have cost the province of British Columbia not less than $30,000 in cold cash, and in order to hold the fort and gain 12 or 15 families, which was the total result of 5 years' intrigue and most godless warfare, the society was made to spend another $30,000 of mission money. At Metlakahtla, they had long had a bylaw forbidding the erection of any building, unless the consent of the council had first been obtained. One of the bishop's followers disregarded this bylaw and irritated the council by following his teacher's example and saying publicly that he would build just whatever and wherever he pleased, without asking the council. The Indians now made a mistake. Instead of prosecuting him, they went to his place and pulled down the few scantlings he had erected. But, improper as this action was, it would hardly seem to warrant the bishop's calling for another warship on these poor people. But he did. It came, and with it a magistrate and an Indian agent. That such a condition of things was not very favorable to the growth of Christian life of the Indians follows of itself. That the people involved in this petty warfare and miserable intrigue, indulged in more or less on both sides, did not lose their religion altogether is a surprise to all who know anything about it, and a living proof of the genuineness and earnestness with which the seed had been planted. An occurrence like the one to be mentioned makes the heart sick. Before one of the numerous commissioners sent up on the warships to investigate Metlakahtla affairs, the bishop, who had paraded through the streets armed with a rifle, so that Mr. Duncan was obliged to request him in writing to desist, as he could not be responsible for what might result from such action during the excited and troublous times in which they were living, testified that he had been fired at. It was night. The shot passed through a window close by him. He distinctly heard the report of the gun, and chased the two villains in the dark, but was outrun. The following morning the bullet was found in the room. All of this was sheer imagination. There had been no gun fired at all. The young man of the bishop's own party had, in sport, intended to toss a small pistol bullet at the wall of the bishop's house, for the purpose of scaring a young girl he saw at the window. Unfortunately, he missed his mark, and the bullet happened to fly in through the window of the room in which the bishop was sitting at the time. That was all there was to it. To put the case very mildly, What must one think of a man with an imagination as lively as that? The fight seemed now simply to have come down to a question of endurance in power to invent causes for trouble between the bishop and the Indians. At one time, when there happened to be nothing else in the wind, the Indians took possession of the schoolhouse as a test case, as they called it, though Mr. Duncan had at first been inclined to make no claim to the building, inasmuch as the government had contributed the small sum of $200 towards its erection. This meant simply another warship. 7 men were tried, 4 of them held by the magistrates, and sent to Victoria to languish in jail for several months, when the case against them was dropped or dismissed by the grand jury, which severely criticized the magistrates for allowing themselves to be made tools of by the bishop. The names of the men, who thus were made to suffer as the first Metlakahtla martyrs jailed at Victoria, are today emblazoned on the roll of honour of the Metlakahtla Indians, and to preserve their names in history they are here given: Cornelius Hudson, Dennis Malone, Charles Spencer, and Edward K. Mather. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Last Blow. But the bitterest fight was to come. The bishop had always claimed ownership of the society to the 2 acres of ground on which the mission buildings were erected. The provincial government of British Columbia had, of late, set up the claim, opposed to the general trend of the policy of Canada, as well as of the United States, in dealing with the Indian claims that the Indians had no rights in the lands which they and their ancestors had been in possession of for centuries before the advent of the white man, and they were wholly dependent for permission to occupy any lands upon all the grace and bounty of the Queen. In order to gain the support and aid of the provincial government in his war upon these Indians, who refused to submit to his lordship's benign rule, the bishop now turned traitor to the interests of all the Indians in the province, sided with the land grabbers and the local government in their unjust claims, and demanded that the government, by virtue of its sole title and ownership of the pretended Indian lands, survey and set aside to the missionary society the 2 acres at the mission point above mentioned. This was more than the Indians could stand. Those who had posed as would-be shepherds and protectors, now ready to turn and rob them of their patrimony. The war cloud commenced to hover over the entire Indian horizon in British Columbia, and no one could tell what the end would be. But Mr. Duncan now stepped forward. He assured the Indians that the Dominion government never would sanction such a policy, and advised that an appeal be made to it. In obedience to this voice of peace, which never had been lifted against the Indians, those in the western part of the province elected 3 delegates, 2 of them leading men of Metlakahtla, John Tate and Edward K. Mather, to accompany Mr. Duncan to Ottawa, in order to invoke the intercession of the Dominion government, anent the attacks of the province on the ancient Indian rights and privileges. So eloquently did Mr. Duncan and his delegation plead the cause of the Indians that Sir John Macdonald, the Premier of Canada, promised not only to prevail upon the Church Missionary Society to withdraw entirely from Metlakahtla, but also to grant the Indians of the province full relief from their oppressors. He asked Mr. Duncan to lay before him in writing a plan for the relief of the Indian grievances. This he did. This plan involved the appointment of a local superintendent of Indian affairs, in direct connection with the Dominion government. Sir John heartily approved of the plan, which he admitted furnished a key to the only practical solution of the difficult Indian question hitherto presented, and promised to carry the scheme through at the next session of the Dominion Parliament. But, he said, there is one difficulty. Unless we could secure the services of yourself as superintendent, I would despair of a successful issue. Very well, said Mr. Duncan. To help the Indians out, I will consent to act as superintendent for 1 year, on condition, however, I receive no salary. Good, answered Sir John. That settles it. In 6 months, your proposed plan shall be the law of the land. That being the case, I think it would be better for me not to return to Metlakahtla until your plans have been fully matured, since for me to go back there under these circumstances would only fan the flames, which I hope we now, with your aid, will entirely subdue. All I ask you, then, is to give the Indian delegates your assurance that the matter will be settled the way they have, through me, asked." This was done. Mr. Duncan went to England, there to await developments, and the delegates returned home, filled with hope that the Queen's government would give them their rights, and fulfill the solemn pledges theretofore made the Indians by Lord Dufferin, the Governor-General, and Her Majesty's representative in Canada. They cheerfully reported to the other Indians at home the fine promises of Sir John. Poor deluded Indians! They did not know that a politician's promises are like ropes of sand. One day they should find out that Sir John Macdonald was only a politician, and that his word of honour, though solemnly given, was not worth a picayune. In London, Mr. Duncan again had an audience with Sir John, in which the same promises were reiterated, and wherein he told him that he had written the Society, and had met a committee from it in London on the matter, and had strictly adhered to his former demands, that they abandon Metlakahtla at once. Before leaving London, however, Sir John had a second conference with the Society, after which he entirely changed front, went back on all his solemn promises to Mr. Duncan and the Indians, and in his official report, soon thereafter issued, appeared in the role of a defender of the bishop and an accuser of Mr. Duncan, who now, in his eyes, had become an intolerable dictator. People have been malicious enough to insinuate that, at this second interview, a bargain was entered into between this Christian, Church Missionary Society, and Sir John, by the terms of which he, in consideration of a complete surrender of the rights of the Indians, secured the support of the sympathizers of the Church of England party of Canada in the approaching general election, which was to decide his fate and that of his party. Mr. Duncan waited the stipulated 6 months. He heard nothing. When 8 months had gone by, and no tidings, he returned by way of Ottawa, sought an interview with Sir John, but could not get it. He then wrote a letter to the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, who promised to write him an answer to Metlakahtla, but no answer came. He then again wrote from Metlakahtla to Sir John. No answer, not even an acknowledgment of the receipt of his letter, which the commonest courtesy certainly would require. Instead of an answer to these letters, came, in the fall of 1886, a surveying party, set out by the Dominion government itself to survey what it was pleased to allow the Indians for a reserve, though no treaty or agreement had ever been made with them for ceding the land which they were now called upon to surrender. The Indians felt that the time had now come for them to assert their rights, or to lie down like cowards and be robbed of all their patrimony. So they concluded to prevent the surveyors from going on with their work. This they did, however, without any violence, though often sorely provoked by the insolence of the surveying party. They simply did it in this way. Whenever the surveyor planted his instrument, the Indians took it up and laid it down. When the surveyor drove a stake, the Indians pulled it up. When the surveyor laid a chain, the Indians took it away. But they kept it up all the time. I can well afford to admit that this was a great mistake. Nothing could be gained by actions of this sort, except what happened after the lapse of some time, to wit, the arrival of another warship, and the deportation of 7 of the leaders in the interference: John Tate, Edward K. Mather, Fred Ridley, Alfred Atkinson, Adolphus Calvert, Moses Baines, and James Smith, and their subsequent incarceration in jail in Victoria for from 3 to 6 months. But we should remember that it was not easy for Mr. Duncan to have their untutored minds grasp any too fine distinctions, where they felt their innate rights so shamefully distorted and played with. The Indians, in order to get a test case in the law courts about the 2 acres claimed by the Society, about the same time erected a small building on a portion of them and put a man in possession. This action finally forced the bishop to start an injunction, or mandamus proceeding, in the courts in Victoria, to compel the tearing down of this offensive little building. Mr. Duncan, who had gone down to Victoria after the survey trouble, to see if nothing could be done to prevent the dispatch of another warship to Metlakahtla and in some way secure some amicable arrangement of the land trouble, was present in court when Chief Justice Begbie announced his decision granting the bishop's application. In doing so, he not only took pains to state from the bench that the Indians had no rights in the land except such as might be accorded to them by the bounty and charity of the Queen of England, but also, as it seems to me, in a very improper and injudicious manner, characterized the utterances of Lord Dufferin, wherein he pledged Her Majesty's government to protect and recognize the rights of the Indians in and to their land as simple blarney for the mob. Mr. Duncan, who still would be detained in Victoria for some time on matters concerning Metlakahtla, wrote the exact language of the judge to the Rev. R. Tomlinson, who in the year 1882 had resigned from the Society's service, and at Mr. Duncan's and the Indians' earnest request, a short time after his resignation had come to Metlakahtla with his lovable family. Mr. Duncan built a fine house for him, anent his coming, and ever since that time Mr. Tomlinson had been Mr. Duncan's faithful and indefatigable co-worker at old Metlakahtla, and undoubtedly a mighty comfort to him in the many trials and tribulations which he, during these years, was destined to endure. As soon as Mr. Duncan's letter arrived and its contents had been communicated to the leaders, a meeting was called of the Indians. As to what there was done we will learn later on. About 2 weeks after writing to Metlakahtla, Mr. Duncan, to his surprise, heard that the steamer from the north had brought down some of his Indians. He went to meet them and found David Leask, Robert Hewson, and Josiah Guthrie at the wharf. They looked solemn, mysterious, and glum. When he wanted to know their errand, they refused to talk then. They all three threw suspicious, fearful glances at the people nearby, indicating to him that they feared everybody and trusted no one. Finally, upon being informed that they would not speak till the next day, and then only if they could meet him all alone, where nobody could overhear, he made an appointment with them for the next forenoon at Senator MacDonald's beautiful home, Armadale. The government of British Columbia at the time consisted of a premier, an attorney general, and a secretary. At 10 o'clock the same evening, Mr. Duncan called at the house of the secretary, Mr. Robson, the only one of the members of the government who seemed to have any conscience about the treatment of the Indians. Mr. Duncan said to him, when alone with him in his library, "A delegation of Indians has just arrived from the north to see me. They are reticent and will not tell me their errand. I am afraid this bodes no good. I come to you now for the last time to see if nothing can be done to stop this trouble. I can speak now, for I know nothing. Tomorrow, after I have seen them and know what they have concluded to do, my mouth will probably be sealed, so I can tell you nothing. There are only one of two decisions that I can imagine they could have come to. One is to leave for Alaska. If it be that, all is good and well. If you hear tomorrow night that I have left for the States, you may know that it is Alaska. But if I do not, I am afraid that it means fight. And if it does, may God have mercy on the white people of this province. You will need to send 5,000 men up there, and they will go there only to be killed too. The Indians will withdraw up the Skeena River, and all the military you can send up there will be simply slaughtered in the canyons, while the Indians will go comparatively free. Your treasury will be depleted, your populations will be murdered, your soldiers will be slaughtered. But if it is fight, don't come to me any more. Don't try to get me to do anything, for I will not. I am going to leave you all to your fate now. I have pleaded and preached and prayed till I am sick at heart at the injustice you have showered on those poor Indians. It is terrible to contemplate, said Mr. Robson, but we have deserved it. I admit it. I admit it. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The New Home. The next evening, Mr. Robson learned that Mr. Duncan had left for Washington. The members of the government slept easier that night. Mr. Duncan says, It grieved me to hear, when I returned from Washington, that the Premier was dead. The magnificent house which this ex-farmer was building for himself in Victoria stood there half finished and now abandoned. The Attorney General was dying and could not be seen. Since then, everyone connected with this crying injustice has died. The vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. At the meeting of the Indians at Metlakahtla, so it was afterwards learned, a great conflict had been raging. Many wanted to take up arms, and martial feeling ran high. It seemed to these people as if there was nothing to live for now. Justice had been denied them everywhere, by ministers and governors and premiers, and now at last, by the courts, their final hope, their last resort. The church was harassing them. The state was incarcerating them and stealing the possessions which they had inherited from the fathers of their fathers. We might as well make a last stand, they said, just as well first as last, just as well fight and kill and die, as to have these highway robbers take away from us the land which our fathers possessed for hundreds of years before a white man put a foot in British Columbia. The more earnest Christians pleaded for Alaska. A Christian can suffer, he can die, but he cannot kill, they said. Let us go to the great land of the free. We are slaves here. There we can be free men. We love this land. We love this beautiful place where our fathers lived and where our children were born. But we love Christ more. Two wrongs cannot make one right. Let us go to Alaska, where we can worship God as we think right, where there will be no bishop to worry and tantalize us, where, as Mr. Duncan tells us, everyone can have his own religion without any persecution, either from church or government. Let us go to a peaceful life, to a life in God. And the Christians won the day. The delegation was sent down to ask Mr. Duncan to go to Washington and ascertain if the Metlakahtla Indians would be allowed to come to Alaska, to seek a refuge there from their troubles, and whether they would be received as citizens of the country and be protected in their rights. If so, they were willing to go and leave all, go where they would be free to worship their God as their consciences dictated, without interference or worry from priest, bishop, or society. Mr. Duncan thought it best first to appeal to some Christian friends in this country, of whom he had read, before addressing the proper officers of the government at Washington, and to ascertain from them the best modus operandi. And he did not appeal in vain to grand, warm-hearted men like the silver-tongued Episcopalian Bishop Phillips Brooks in Boston and the patriotic Henry Ward Beecher in Brooklyn. Both of them opened their magnificent churches for him and gave him their moral support in a unanimous request by their congregations to our government to grant these homeless Indians a refuge in our Alaskan archipelago. Arrived at Washington, he was received by the representatives of our government, President Cleveland, his Secretary of State and of the Interior, and his Attorney General, with friendly feelings, and assured privately that he and his Indians were welcome to choose themselves a home in Alaska, and that in time, undoubtedly, some action would be taken by the Congress fully to secure them in their rights, if they themselves would select an island suitable to their purposes, but that officially nothing could at the time be done which might be construed by Great Britain as an unfriendly act to the Canadian government, or to the government of any of its provinces. This promise was honorably redeemed when, in 1891, at the solicitation of these same government officials, as well as of the then Governor of Alaska, the Congress of the United States did, by the Act of March 30, 1891, until otherwise provided by law, set apart the body of land known as the Annette Islands, in Alexander Archipelago, in southeastern Alaska, as a reservation for the use of the Metlakahtla Indians, and such other of the Alaska natives as may join them, to be held and used by them in common, under such rules and regulations, and subject to such restrictions as may be prescribed from time to time by the Secretary of the Interior. Mr. Duncan never overlooks anything. He had foreseen the possibility of his people being obliged to immigrate to Alaska in order to enjoy religious and civic liberty, and for that contingency he had already looked up where eligible and desirable sites for the new colony might be found. As soon as it was made apparent to him that a way would be opened to their immigration to Alaska, he wrote to Mr. Tomlinson and to Dr. J. D. Bluett Duncan, a devoted Christian gentleman of means from England, who had at home read about the wonderful colony built up under Mr. Duncan's fostering care, and some 2 or 3 years before had come out to see with his own eyes, and had remained to give the Indians, without cost or charge, the benefit of his professional services, and in other ways to give Mr. Duncan what assistance he could. Mr. Duncan's letter suggested that a deputation of Indians should go at once and examine certain eligible sites for a new colony, which he suggested, and select the one that seemed to them best. This was done at once. 5 Indians, accompanied by Dr. Bluett Duncan, started on a voyage of exploration. 70 miles north of the old village, on the other side of Dixon Entrance, they came to Port Chester, on the northwest side of Annette Island. The beautiful waterfall giving promise of a splendid water power, the sheltered bay, the fine canoe beaches, the gently rising stretch of land directly back of the beach, the luxurious growth of cedars, spruce, and hemlock, all won upon their eyes, and one of the Indians said, "It is no use to go any further. We can certainly not find anything finer than this if we go 1,000 miles. This voiced the opinion of all. Thus, on the 25th day of March, 1887, one of the loveliest spots in Alaska was selected as the new home, in the country of the brave and the free, for the persecuted and hounded Metlakahtla Indians. Here, under the protection of the Stars and Stripes, this race, which had already made such wonderful strides in civilization, Christian virtues, and civic progress, should recover from the cruel blows given it by bigotry and priestcraft, and its little village should blossom forth in peace and prosperity as the model Christian community of Alaska, the faraway Northland, its fame to redound into all lands and among all people. The Indians who had the honor of selecting this new home of the colony were David Leask, John Tate, Edward Benson, Adam Gordon, and Fred Ridley. The explorers at once returned to their home, and made a glowing report of what they had found. The selection was, in a short time, ratified by all. Thanks be to God, peace should once more reign among them. Strife and vexatious irritation and continuous brawling should cease. Happiness shone in every face. Word was sent to Mr. Duncan, notifying him of their selection of the new home. Soon pioneers were dispatched to build temporary huts near the beach, while the rest of the villagers went on their usual summer tours to gather and put up the winter supply of food. July gone, and the canoes returning, many started directly for the new home, to assist in the work of erecting the temporary houses. On August 7, 1887, about noon, a gun announced the arrival of the steamer Ancon. It brought Mr. Duncan, who landed at once, accompanied by some American gentlemen on board. A temporary flagstaff was rigged up, and under the boom of a cannon, the Stars and Stripes were hoisted for the first time on that shore. The Indians, with solemn mien, uncovered their heads as the silken banner, a present from friends in the States, slowly rose above them, and unfurled to the breeze of the most beautiful colors any nation could ever boast of. Speeches were made by the Honorable H. R. Dawson, United States Commissioner of Education, and by Mr. Duncan. But more eloquent than the speeches were the silent tears glistening in the eyes of the stalwart Indians, as they were looking admiringly up at the flag, under whose protecting folds the future of their little nation was to be lived. They spoke of the untold sufferings and sorrows of the past years. They also spoke eloquently of the living hope of the relief the future would bring. And with silent praise to God for their deliverance, there arose to the throne of the Almighty at that moment, I am told, from those Indian hearts, many a wish for the success of the great nation, which now held its protecting banner above the little persecuted flock. Since that day, there are 4 great holidays celebrated at Metlakahtla every year. Christmas Day, the birth of the Christ. New Year's Day, the birth of the year. 4th of July, the birth of the nation. And the 7th of August, Pioneer Day, as it is called, the birthday of New Metlakahtla, for so was the new haven of rest christened. At 3 o'clock that day, divine services were held on the beach. the first conducted by Mr. Duncan in American Alaska. Then in song and praise and prayer, in the soft flowing language of the Tsimshians, the native heart was lifted up to and beyond the beautiful flag now floating above their heads, into the Holy of Holies of the glorious heavens. The next morning, while Mr. Duncan's effects, including a complete steam sawmill outfit which he had bought in Portland, were unloaded and stored in the log house built for him, filling it to overflowing, he himself was compelled to live in a tent during the first fall months. George Usher, a prominent native, was by him sent back to old Metlakahtla to bring the Indians there news of the arrival of their leader. As George Usher plowed the blue, sapphire waves of the North Pacific with his paddle, he composed a song or chant with which to greet his people. When he arrived in the inlet at old Metlakahtla, he did not run his canoe up on the beach. Indian fashion, he stopped a little distance from shore, where he rested on his paddle. Someone on shore espied and recognized him. Like lightning, the message flew through the village. The steamer, which was supposed to carry the chief, had been seen pass by, going north, a couple of days ago. In the twinkling of an eye, it seemed, the beach was black with people, who swarmed out of their homes and yards, men, women, and children. The whole village was there. Even some of the bishop's party ventured forth. Then came over the waves, in words of song, the glad message in their own beloved tongue. The great chief has come. He has gone to our new home. Now he sends me to you. He bids you come, one and all. We shall be slaves no longer. The land of freedom has accepted us. The flag of the Boston men is hoisted at the site of a new Metlakahtla. It will protect us and our freedom. We can worship God in peace. We can secure the happiness of our children. They will be the freemen of a great nation. Come, therefore, one and all. Gather your little ones around you. Push the canoes from the beach. Good wind will fill our sails. We will hasten to the land of freedom. Hardly had the last note died away over the waves when the scraping of the canoe keels on the sand was heard. In less than an hour, 10 canoes, filled with men anxious to see with their own eyes their new home, were on the way. After temporary log huts were erected, the return voyage was made. And now, as the Pilgrim Fathers of old, they came back with women and children, and with what little of their possessions they were allowed to take, in canoe fleets towed across Dixon Entrance by their little cannery steamer, Princess Louise, and by the Methodist Gospel boat, Glad Tidings, chartered for the occasion. It stands to reason that many a tear glistened in the Indians' black eyes as they left their old home, where their fathers had lived for generations back, where their children had been born, where they themselves had seen the great light, and been received into Christ's church on earth, where they left so many of their dear departed behind. But though cruel persecution asserted itself at the very last moment, and denied them the right to take along even the windows and doors of the houses they themselves had built, the sawmill machinery, and the lathes and other machinery they had owned, the looms they had bought and paid for, the very organ in their church, to which every Indian had contributed his $2.50, or $500 in all, the carpet which their women had provided for their church, after the rupture, the prows of their canoes were headed north, towards the land of freedom, towards a haven of rest from petty spite and persecution, and the sobs of parting were choked down, and the brows lifted in hope and courage. In that hour, big with the future, all was soon forgotten but the glorious hope of the morrow lying ahead of them. Though deprived of all they had toiled for during a lifetime, though smarting under the cruel injustice which had, in the name of Holy Church, taken from them what was theirs, and driven them from hearth and home, appropriated their houses and gardens, their church and school, without a penny of compensation. Nevertheless, this host of Christians went forth to a strange land, in their heart of hearts glad to sacrifice what they did for the sake of their faith and religion, and smiling through their tears. Quite 823 of the 948 constituting the population of the village left that fall for New Metlakahtla. Some who did not belong to the bishop's party remained, not because they sympathized with him, but because they had not the moral courage to pull up stakes and start again in a strange land. The real strength of the bishop's party did not, at the time, muster over 94, counting in his white retainers. He and his followers did not hesitate to reap where they had not sown. It was said that it was with a look of satisfaction the bishop contemplated his victory, that he actually smiled when he saw these poor natives driven from home and all that was theirs. Had they not dared to oppose his divine lordship? And now he and his adherents took possession. Theirs was the church, and the school, and the mission house, and the weavery, and the cannery, and the sawmill, the store, and the factories, and the buildings, and Mr. Duncan's own house, paid for out of his own private funds. All was theirs, with none to dispute their title. As the last fleet of canoes glided away over the placid waves of the inlet, carrying those who had come to fetch some portion of what had belonged to them, but who now were compelled to return with empty hands, because the state's aid had not in vain been invoked by the church, but had stayed their hands from taking what was theirs. I fancy I can hear a satanic "ha ha" echoing back from the mountain peaks, as the bishop contemplated all the possessions which he had found on his hands. But what easily comes, easily goes, the proverb says. One day in 1901, fire from heaven devoured all the bishop's ill-gotten gains. The magnificent church, the school, the cannery, the factory buildings, the mission house, practically everything that had been stolen from these poor people went up in smoke, carrying with it the bishop's private possessions, his books, and his manuscripts. In fact, all that he owned. Indeed, Mr. Duncan could say, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Since that time, the Society has, in 1903, built a small church. It has built the Ridley House, a boarding school for half-breed Indian children, which still is in operation. Everything has been done by the provincial government to foster old Metlakahtla and keep the dying mission there going. A school for boys and a school for girls have been built, and operated by the aid of ludicrously excessive grants from the government. But it seems that the end of this artificial hothouse gardening has now come. The government did, in 1908, withdraw its support, and both of the schools are now deserted. The furniture was sold at auction in the summer of that year. The new day school building, erected by the government and just finished this summer, will be wholly useless, as there are school buildings enough and to spare for the present population, which, according to the figures furnished me by the Indian agent, totals 187, including the boarders at the schools. Of the many assistants of Bishop Ridley, there now remain at old Metlakahtla only the venerable missionary, the Reverend J. H. Keene, who, when I visited there, during the summer of 1908, acted as his own schoolmaster as well, and Miss M. West, the principal of the Ridley home. Bishop Duvernay has moved his episcopal seat to Prince Rupert, a new town in the making, on a neighboring island and the intended terminus of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. The Metlakahtla Indians, still remaining at old Metlakahtla, had a windfall a year or so ago when the railroad company paid them something in the neighborhood of $50,000 to acquire their reservation interest in the lands on which Prince Rupert is to be partly located. This money has, by these Indians, been invested in modern dwelling houses. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Pioneers. At New Metlakahtla, the pioneers found work enough before them. The dense primeval forest extended down to the beach. The giant trees, all the way from 1 to 6 feet in diameter, quite a distance from the ground, had to be felled, stumps removed, the land cleared, and ground drained before the permanent allotment of town lots could be made. They all went at it with a will. While there had, many years ago, been a small Tlingit village at the spot, the only evidence of it now was an old totem pole, which has since been removed, and now is found in the museum at Sitka. One of the first public buildings to be erected was the sawmill, where a plant was installed, and kept busy sawing the lumber for temporary buildings, as well as for use the next summer in the erection of a cannery building. As to permanent dwellings, the edict of Mr. Duncan was that none should be built for the first 2 years. He was afraid that some of those who had come might desire to return to the fleshpots of old Metlakahtla after a while, and he did not desire that they should be held back by having permanent and costly improvements. The same spirit was over him as of old. There was to be no discontent. All should be footloose, so that they could pull up and go back if their hearts were not in it. In spite of this, only 2 or 3 families returned. One of his first acts was to gather the adult men together and explain to them their duties to the new country, which had received them so kindly. It was a sight worth witnessing, when, in the faint glimmer of the oil lamps, all these swarthy men, young and old, at the behest of their beloved leader, who already held a magistrate's commission, one evening held up their right hands, and with a patriotic glow in their eyes, solemnly and collectively swore allegiance to their adopted country. The proceeding was not authorized by law, but Mr. Duncan knew that it would, as far as the Indians were concerned, have just the same effect as had it been a legal proceeding. He wanted to bind them at once with the ties of allegiance to the new country. The next thing to do was to draft and adopt a constitution for the new community, which every resident of the village had to accept and sign, before he could be considered as having any rights there. The result of Mr. Duncan's labors in that direction was the following: Declaration of Residence. We, the people of Metlakahtla, Alaska, in order to secure to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of a Christian home, do severally subscribe to the following rules for the regulation of our conduct and town affairs. 1. To reverence the Sabbath, and to refrain from all unnecessary secular work on that day, to attend divine worship, to take the Bible for our rule of faith, to regard all true Christians as our brethren, and to be truthful, honest, and industrious. 2. To be faithful and loyal to the government and laws of the United States. 3. To render our votes when called upon for the election of the town council, and to promptly obey the bylaws and orders imposed by the said council. 4. To attend to the education of our children, and keep them at school as regularly as possible. 5. To totally abstain from all intoxicants and gambling, and never to attend heathen festivities or countenance heathen customs in surrounding villages. 6. To strictly carry out all sanitary regulations necessary for the health of the town. 7. To identify ourselves with the progress of the settlement, and to utilize the land we hold. 8. Never to alienate, give away, or sell our land, or building lots, or any portion thereof, to any person or persons who have not subscribed to these rules. This Constitution has never been changed or amended, and is faithfully lived up to unto the present time. After the ground had been cleared and drained, the village was surveyed, and a plan made of the blocks and streets. Here again the wonderful wisdom of Mr. Duncan showed itself. All envy and jealousy must be kept out of the new community. So, in making up the town plat, he divided every block into 4 lots of 80 by 90, in order that every native householder should have a corner lot. But now came the question, how to distribute the different lots, so that there would be no trouble. There was a preference, of course. The lots facing the beach, or rather the public street running immediately above and along the beach, were the best and the handiest for a population which spent half its life in the canoe or boat. The first method of distribution was by the drawing of lots, but the result convinced Mr. Duncan that it would not give satisfaction. So, thinking it over during the night, he evolved another mode, which he felt sure would be successful. Calling them together the next day, he announced that all done the day before would have to be annulled. "I am not going to have you feel badly towards each other, if I can help it," he said. "Now I have thought out this plan. The oldest brother in each family chooses his lot first, then the second, the third, and the fourth. Then, if there are more, the same proceeding is resorted to in the block back of the front block, etc. If you do not then get what you want, don't blame me, but blame yourselves for not having come into the world any sooner than you did." The humor of this parting shot took hold of the Indian mind, and the plan worked satisfactorily. The Rev. R. Tomlinson, Mr. Duncan's faithful co-worker at Old Metlakahtla for the past 5 years, came over to the new place for a few weeks, but as he could not find any conveniences for his large family, he left them behind in Mr. Duncan's house at the former home. After consultation, they came to the agreement that Mr. Duncan, as he now would not be called away from the settlement to fight the battles of the natives against the bishop's continuous and sinister attacks, could perhaps get along alone. And as Mr. Tomlinson was anxious to take up again, at the first opportunity, his work among the upper Skeena River Tsimshians, the Jonathan and David of the coast had an affectionate parting, and Mr. Tomlinson thereafter located at Meonskinnisht, the foot of the pitch pines, where he ever since has continued to carry on a blessed work on his own account, without the support of any mission society. The fruits of this work will perhaps never be fully known until that great day when our accounts up yonder are finally closed. Dr. Blewett Duncan also accompanied Mr. Duncan to the land of freedom, and for more than 5 years not only gave them the benefit of his Christian sympathy and practical advice, but also relieved him, at a time when his attention was greatly needed in other directions, of the duty of giving medical attendance to the sick. It stands to reason that by the persecutions to which Mr. Duncan and the Metlakahtlans had been exposed at the hands of both church and state in British America, and by their being deprived of their property, as well as of the fruits of years of labor and saving, their funds were not in very excellent state to withstand the drain of removal, and of building up anew their little town. While Mr. Duncan has always been averse to asking any help whatsoever from anyone, friends were by God in this their hour of need, mainly by the valuable assistance of Henry S. Wellcome, a wealthy Englishman, who at his own expense published and spread broadcast a book on the glorious work of Mr. Duncan, raised up both in America and England, with the result that within 2 years of the removal to Alaska, the Benevolent Fund, as Mr. Duncan has styled it, had reached the sum of $6,591.55. At midnight on June 28, 1889, the colony had the misfortune to see the destruction by fire of their sawmill and of all their sawed and dressed lumber, entailing a loss of over $12,000, as there was no insurance. On July 10th, Mr. Duncan was already on his way to Portland to purchase machinery for a new mill. It is evident that it had not taken a long time to make an American of him. Though he was not then possessed of the means with which to pay for it, he felt the absolute necessity of quick action, if the building up of the new village should not receive a serious setback. He succeeded in getting the extra time allowed him. In less than 3 months from the date of the fire, a new mill of greater capacity was running at full blast, and by the following May, friends in America had contributed anent this loss the sum of $6,069.92, thus covering about half the actual misfortune. Practically all of this amount had been raised through the magnificent efforts of the Honorable E. J. Thomas of Brookline, Massachusetts, who has since gone home to his father's house. In the meantime, the building lots distributed had been deeded to the persons entitled to them by the village council, on payment of a $3 fee, which was covered into the treasury. The lots were being cleared, fences built, berry and vegetable gardens started, and the building of permanent houses commenced. The dwellings were mostly square, 2-story buildings built of dressed lumber and provided with verandas and porches. In March 1891, Mr. Duncan could report that 91 substantial new dwellings had been erected. The number of dwellings in the village today is 130. Every year, of late, some of the residents have discarded their old homes and built new houses. Most of them, however, have been concerned, as far as the improvement of their property goes, in freshly painting their dwellings, and putting in new picket fences around their lots. Even among the houses built of late years, the square 2-story building style seems to be the one predominating, but a few of the more recently built homes would in style and arrangement do honor to any little New England village of its size. Among them may be mentioned Tom Hanbury's house, built in 1902, painted dark green with white trimmings; Alex Guthrie's bungalow, built in 1903, painted pink with white trimmings and dark red shingled roof; and Benjamin A. Haldane's house, built in 1906 and painted orange with white trimmings and dark green shingled roof. The monument in front of his house was placed there in honor of his deceased father, Matthew Haldane, one of Mr. Duncan's most trusted friends, who is not, however, laid to rest at this place. He was buried in the cemetery. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. A Day at Metlakahtla. Among the industries started at New Metlakahtla was a printing establishment. One of the natives was sent to Portland to learn typesetting and printing, and a small outfit of type and hand press were procured. On this press was, within a year after the flitting from British Columbia, printed a little hymn book, or church manual, as the title page styles it, of 36 pages, containing 11 hymns in English, 14 hymns in Tsimshian, part of them translations from well-known English church hymns, and part original compositions by Mr. Duncan, the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and some 50 suitable selections from the Scriptures in English, and the Lord's Prayer and the Apostolic Benediction in Tsimshian. On this printing press also was printed from time to time, with intervals of from 2 months to 1 year, 8 numbers of a little 4-page, 2-column, 10-by-7 paper, the Metlakahtlan, aiming to be a sort of means of communication between the new community and its friends in the States. The date of the first issue is November 1888, and of the last, December 1891. As, by this time, I take it, the readers have become so much interested in the personality of Mr. Duncan that they will prefer to hear as much as they possibly can from him personally. It will perhaps not be amiss here to reproduce an article from his pen in the first number of this paper, entitled A Day at Metlakahtla, both because it, in itself, is rich in interesting news from the new settlement at this early date, and also because it gives a veritable pen picture of what was required of this wonderful man from day to day, while he was superintending and assisting in building up a new home for his people, as well as his unlimited capacity for all kinds of work. The article reads as follows. November 13th, 1888. The weather this morning, like yesterday, is fair, bright and frosty. Such a delightful change from the dreary and soaking wet weather we have had for the last 2 months. Having 22 men employed, I begin the duties of the day by going to look after them. I found waterproof coats were doffed, and everybody outside seemed brisk and busy. Before I had finished my inspection, I was summoned to breakfast, but I told the cook to ask Dr. Bluet not to wait for me. Having finished my work outside, I took a hasty meal. Then the school bell rang, and quickly 132 children, all with happy faces, took their places in the school. We commenced school as usual by singing a verse of the good old hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. Prayer followed, and then the Scripture lesson, the subject this morning being the meeting of Jacob and Esau. The children then marched to their classes, 7 in number, the sexes being divided, with the exception of the first class. I have 3 native assistants, and we go to work at what is called the 3 R's, and soon the usual hum of school sets in. We teach the children to read and write in English, but I am sorry to say the lessons furnished in the primary reading books are generally very unsuitable for Indian children, having too much nonsense about cats owning tails, and dogs being able to bark, and so forth, all such information appearing very ridiculous to the Indian aspirant after learning, when translated into his mother tongue. This morning the reading lesson in one class was exceptionally good. It was the fable of the dog and the shadow, After reading the lesson, the children were asked to write on their slates what they thought was the lesson the fable teaches us. One boy wrote, "When people let fall the truth, they find nothing." We have no fire in our school, and the building we are temporarily using is so draughty that if King Alfred with his candle clock occupied it, he would be obliged to use curtains to keep the flame steady. I therefore gave the children 10 minutes recess to warm themselves by a scamper on the beach. The lively scene which ensued would take too long to describe. I suppose this is the only school in Alaska where there is no fire, yet I doubt very much whether there is such another healthy community of children in any part of the territory as ours is. Time being up, lessons recommenced. At the end of the 3 school hours, the children seemed glad to get their freedom. The boys rushed to secure their wonted place for their favorite game of marbles, and so fascinated are they with this game that they seem to forget they need any food before returning to school. On several occasions I have caught them playing in the pouring rain, and twice lately I saw them playing on the road by the light of a lantern. I see that an Indian boy is as proud of his bag of marbles as a white boy is. A little pleasant excitement was caused in the village this morning by 2 men, employed by our musicians, setting to work to fell a huge and noble-looking pine. The stir was due to the difficulty of the undertaking. The tree had to be cut about 24 feet from the ground, and made to fall in a certain direction to avoid crushing the houses near it. The men performed their work admirably, and were so elated with their success that they nailed a pole on top of the stump with 4 small American flags attached to it. The 24 feet of trunk left standing is to form the base for a stand on which the brass band will be mounted to greet our friends or any government officials when they come to see us. In the afternoon I went to our steam sawmill to talk over the work to be done with our native foreman. The men have lately completed an order of over 16,000 cases from a salmon cannery about 30 miles off. All the work of sawing, planing, and stenciling these cases was done by the natives, and done so satisfactorily that the order given us for another year is nearly doubled. I then stepped into a sash and furniture workshop, lately erected by 2 native artisans on their own account. They have managed to bring into their service a small stream, to turn the wheel by which their lathe is worked. The men were busy executing an order from a neighboring Indian tribe for a grave fence. I noticed too that they had finished a nice-looking bedstead of yellow cypress, which I learn forms part of an order from Portland, Oregon. My business with them was to tender the work of making me some large windows and doors for the new school we are erecting, if we can agree upon the terms. I left them to think over the prices, and let me know them tonight. I next walked to the site on which we are erecting our permanent school, and gave some directions to the workmen. In the evening, several of the men came to receive their wages, and others to pay their accounts for lumber obtained at the mill. After supper, one of our people came to see me privately, about a family quarrel, which he wished me to help him to settle. While, however, he was telling his story, another man walked in to press his complaint against the man of a distant tribe, a Haida, who with his party happened to be here for the purpose of trade, and staying in the village guest-house. As it was supposed the accused man would be leaving our village early the next morning, I concluded to settle his case first. Accordingly, I sent for the native constable, who holds a commission from the government, and directed him to go and tell the stranger I wanted to see him, and that he might bring his friends with him. As the Haida and Tsimshian languages are totally unlike, I also sent for one of our people who knows them both, to act as interpreter. In the meantime, several persons dropped in to listen, and as soon as the Haida and his friends arrived, we opened the case. The affair was this. The complainant and the accused had met while hunting bears on Prince of Wales Island. The former greeted the latter courteously, but his civility was not reciprocated. The Haida, both by looks and words, and still more particularly by suspiciously manipulating his gun, showed signs of anger. The complainant stated that he had kept his temper, otherwise he felt sure violence would have ensued. In defense, the accused said that the complainant, not knowing the Haida language, had allowed his fears to be unnecessarily aroused, that the angry words he used were not addressed to the complainant, but to the Haida in company with him, and as for the way he carried his gun, that was explained by the fact he was hunting bears. As no act of violence had been committed, or threatening language used, it remained for me only to caution and instruct the accused man, which I did very fully. I was glad to find that my words were well received. He thanked me, and said he was glad to hear good words, and know the law, and on his return home he would not fail to tell his people what he had learned. The complainant and the accused then shook hands, and went away with the greater part of the audience. Among the few remaining were the man who came in first about the family quarrel, and a Haida, not from the same village as the man I had just dismissed, who had some trouble to tell me of. The latter said he had chosen a young woman from the Tlingit people for a wife, and both the young woman and her guardian had favoured his suit. The engagement being made, he went over to her tribe, and had already given a month's labour to her relations for their goodwill. For some reason, however, of which he professed to be ignorant, her guardian had suddenly annulled the agreement, and ordered him to leave the village. I promised to send a message to the persons concerned by the first canoe which leaves here, and when I have ascertained the facts on the other side, I shall know what to advise in the case. There are, I am sorry to say, some old customs still rife among these tribes in regard to marriage, which are constantly provoking trouble. When questioned individually, not an Indian will venture to defend them, and yet they retain their hold on the public mind. After the Haida had left, I addressed the man who had patiently waited some hours for a private interview about his family affairs. The remedy for his trouble was humility and kindness. These I prescribed for him, and he went away. I then had 2 foremen to talk with about the morrow's work. After they had left me, I took a peep at the beautiful moonlit sky. Soon I heard the bugle sounding in the village, the welcome, "Go to bed." And then came my quiet hour for reading. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Leaves from Mr. Duncan's Diary. Before proceeding with a short account of the history of the village, in the way of industrial and other development, I will invite the reader to partake of a little treat from Mr. Duncan's diary, from which I have already, during the earlier phases of the history of the mission, drawn quite liberally. This diary was faithfully kept up by Mr. Duncan from the day he left England until within a few years ago. It is not to be understood, however, that he made entries in this diary from day to day, but now and then, as something out of the ordinary happened, he chronicled the occurrence more in the nature of a complete sketch than by attempting to give its gradual development each day. I am particularly inclined to reproduce these extracts from his diary, because they will give the reader an idea of the celebration of Christmas and New Year's Day among these people every year, also because they contain brief mention of some of the last law cases with which Mr. Duncan was burdened. In a few years, white settlements were started nearby, and he then cheerfully limited his magisterial duties to his own people. Although Mr. Duncan ever since has been, and still is, a United States Commissioner, with all the powers and duties of a magistrate, so peacefully inclined are these people, and so little crime is committed by or among them, at least when at home, that for years this office of Mr. Duncan's has been the merest sinecure. In fact, his only duty has consisted in making out his annual report to this effect. Number of cases tried? None. Amount of fees and fines collected? None. Amount of disbursements? None. I call the following entries from his diary, with such parts omitted which I do not think of particular interest at the present time. December 18th, 1888. Rarely a day passes that I have not some grievances to settle, but one brought before me today was of more than ordinary interest. reminding me of my early days among the Tsimshians in British Columbia. A native named Inuetka, from the village of Metlakahtla, about 30 miles off, came here a few days ago to lay a complaint against one Skigahn of the same village. He was accompanied by a brother to act as his spokesman, and his gloomy and morose looks indicated his trouble was of a very serious nature. I then listened to a long and painful story, which convinced me that the complainant and the accused were deadly rivals, and that in order to prevent them from shedding each other's blood, no time was to be lost in settling their quarrel. I therefore at once wrote a letter to Skigahn to inform him that Inuetka was at Metlakahtla waiting to meet him before me, and that I would undertake to settle their differences as peacemaker if he would come here without delay. But if he refused my invitation, I should be obliged to send men with a warrant to arrest him. I well knew that neither Skigahn nor any of his people could read the letter I sent, but it served as a seal to the verbal message I gave to the bearer. Inuetka and his brother both doubted the efficacy of my plan, assuring me that Skigahn would not come to Metlakahtla unless I sent a force to take him. Events have shown, however, that their forebodings were uncalled for. Today Skigahn arrived, having travelled over 30 miles of dangerous sea in his canoe, with his aged uncle and other members of his family. Tonight a large gathering of our people assembled to listen to the case. Skigahn, a bold and stern-looking man, took his seat with a defiant stare at his accuser, Inuetka, and the latter at once began to relate a series of attacks made upon his person and property. I took notes. Skigahn sat silent and stolid till his turn came to make his countercharges against Inuetka. Finally it appeared that the offences each had committed against the other were pretty evenly balanced, and each had, while under the influence of liquor, attempted to take the life of the other. The case gave me ample scope and illustration for a serious address on the misery of a sinful and lawless life, an opportunity for showing in contrast the blessings which the gospel of Christ, if embraced, would ensure them. After my address, a solemn scene ensued. Both Inuetka and Skigahn stood up, and each placed his hand on the Bible as a token of their sincere desire to forgive and forget the wrongs of the past. This done, they approached each other and shook hands, which act evoked many expressions of joy from the audience. Thus a deadly feud was healed. The mail steamer Idaho, which we have been expecting for the last 12 days, arrived this morning, bringing us some freight from Portland. As our supply of flour and groceries was almost exhausted, and Christmas was very near, the arrival of the steamer caused great rejoicing in the village, and especially among the children. Her delay, we were sorry to learn, was due to some crippling injuries she had sustained in a gale of wind on her last downward trip. The steamer being bound for Sitka, the seat of government for Alaska, we had, I regret to say, 5 passengers for her, 2 white men being prisoners, and 3 natives acting as guards. The 2 men were arrested on their way north by canoe over 2 weeks ago for smuggling intoxicating liquors, and I had to commit them for trial at Sitka. The greater portion, some 240 gallons, of their liquor fell into our hands, and remains in our custody till we receive orders from Sitka what to do with it. Sunday, December 23rd, 1888. Our unusually large attendance at church during the winter season was augmented today by the addition of some 60 or 70 strangers who arrived here yesterday to spend Christmas with us. Though they came without being invited, they were heartily welcomed and hospitably received by our people. Our guests are from 4 native villages and of 2 distinct languages, both being very different to the language of the Metlakahtlans. Monday, January 7th, 1889. Christmas and New Year is always a joyous season with the people of Metlakahtla, and the last one has proved to be no exception to the rule. Though still living in temporary shanties, built among stumps and huge trees, both standing and fallen, yet the people are healthy and happy. Some few days before Christmas, the usual avocations of the natives are suspended. Smiling faces greet you everywhere, and the village storekeepers are overwhelmed with business. The church elders hold meetings for the purpose of restoring the fallen and reconciling to each other persons who have quarreled. On Christmas Eve, there is a noticeable stillness outside, but the houses are illuminated. The waits are rehearsing their Christmas carols in the schoolroom, and I have deputations from the officials of the village, council, elders, constables, brass band, and fire brigade, to interrogate me about the proceedings of tomorrow. Late at night, the two men, one being a born artist, who have designed and secretly prepared some Christmas decorations, are busy arranging them in our temporary church. During the first hours of Christmas morning, the voices of 30 of our young men are heard outside, singing hymns of praise, some in their own tongue and some in English. On Christmas morning, at 11 o'clock, our church was crowded for divine service. The decorations were admirable, both in design and execution. The principal figure was an angel with outstretched wings, holding in each hand an olive branch, and supporting most gracefully by both hands a flying scroll some 30 feet long, on which was written, "On earth peace, goodwill to men. Nations shall learn war no more." The service was commenced by chanting our Christmas song in Tsimshian, and preceding the address the choir sang the anthem, "God is the refuge of his people." The collection amounted to $130.08, the largest sum ever contributed by our people on one occasion. The money will be passed to the building fund for the proposed new church. The afternoon was occupied with the children. Happy family indeed, 190 of whom received toys, while but 5 were sent empty away for misconduct. The last night in the year was dark and stormy. Nevertheless, the attendance at our midnight meeting was very large. The order of service was as follows: hymn in Tsimshian on the departure of another year, prayer, address on Peter's bitter repentance, silent prayer from 11:55 to 12:05, singing the prodigal's resolve, and a hymn on the opening year, address on St. Paul's cry for guidance, anthem, safely through another year, the service being closed with prayer by 2 of the elders. The 1st of January was a memorable day at Metlakahtla. In the morning, all the men assembled to witness the admittance of 15 new members to our male community, 10 of whom were from 4 native villages nearby, and 5 were Tsimshians. The newcomers were placed in the center of the building, and, after my address, each approached the table and placed his left hand on the Bible, and raised his right, in token of the sincerity of his act. He then subscribed his name to be a faithful member of our community, obedient to the law, and loyal to the government of the United States. In the evening, all the men again assembled, this time for tea, talk, and music. The strangers were invited, and their table was placed in the center of the building. Our feast consisted of biscuits, tea, apples, and raisins. The brass band played at intervals, and 16 stirring speeches were made. After my address, we sang the doxology, and the meeting closed. Before leaving, the council and elders tendered their badges of office, as the new elections for these offices will take place this week. January 18, 1889. Sad news. A canoe manned by natives arrived from Tongass late last night, bringing the corpse of a murdered man and the murderer, both white men. This morning I held an inquest and took the depositions of witnesses. The 6 jurors were Metlakahtlians, and on their verdict I committed the accused for trial. He will leave here under native guard in a few days. Intoxicating liquor, procured as usual at Port Simpson from the store of the Hudson's Bay Company, was at the bottom of this sad tragedy. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Some Metlakahtla history. One of the first public buildings erected in Metlakahtla, Alaska, was the village store. It is operated by Mr. Duncan and carries a stock of general merchandise of the average value of about $20,000. The goods are sold to the natives at a small advance over the cost price. Not far away from the store is Mr. Duncan's private dwelling and office. In the front part of this building is his office. On one side of this office is his bedroom, and on the other a storeroom for his account books and papers. In the rear is a dining room, high-ceiled as his office, and both heated only with fireplaces. Adjoining the dining room are 3 bedrooms and the kitchen. In this lowly dwelling, Mr. Duncan has always insisted on remaining, though far better quarters have for years been near at hand, but remain unoccupied, except for occasional visitors. During the first 2 years in Metlakahtla, Alaska, there was no regular house of worship. The temporary schoolroom was too small, so at first the services were held on the beach and the rocks, and later on in a shed built for industrial purposes. But on the 29th day of April, 1889, a queer-looking building with 12 gables, intended originally for the public school, was finished, and here divine services were held until the large, fine church was completed. Of late, this building, which is heated with hot water and lighted by large oil lamps, had been denominated the Town Hall. The natives have their feasts or tea parties here on festive occasions, and here all concerts and public entertainments take place. In March 1890, the Boys' Home, a building in the shape of St. Peter's Cross, was ready for occupancy, but could not be taken in use till the next year, when a new teacher arrived. The Boys' Home, because of want of proper teachers, did not prove a success. Its name was changed to the Educational Building, and the public school for children of both sexes was there housed. In it now are also located the Young Men's Evening Schoolroom, the Sunday School Teacher's Classroom, the place for the midweek prayer meeting, and the Public Reading Room. The same fall, the Mission Building, or the Industrial Training School for Girls, with rooms on one side for the teacher's family and on the other for the doctor's, as well as for the pharmacy of the village, which is well stocked with all necessary medicines and preparations, was ready from the builder's hand. Upstairs are dormitories for 24 girls, and below, in the center of the house, the dining room, and in front a large school hall, which now, for several years, has been used as the council room, where the village council holds its meetings. Both this hall and the large schoolroom in the Educational Building are heated by open fireplaces in the center of the room. A large hood of sheet iron comes down above the fireplace, and not only carries away the smoke, but acts as a splendid ventilator. In the spring of 1890, a cannery building was erected, and that summer a beginning was made of the salmon canning industry. 470 cases of 4 dozen cans each were canned. But as Mr. Duncan's funds were not sufficient to carry on this business on the scale which was necessary if it should prove profitable, he finally was induced to ask some friends of his for assistance in the following way. A corporation, the Metlakahtla Industrial Company, was formed, with $25,000 capital stock. Of this stock, Mr. Duncan and a few of the natives took about half. The other half was donated by friends of the mission, with the understanding that if the enterprise came through all right, they should be paid back the money advanced. If not, they would lose it, and he would be under no obligation to repay them. On the 1st of January, 1895, Mr. Duncan formally turned over to this corporation all the industries of the colony, the store and the sawmill, as well as the cannery. This business was managed so prudently that, in 1905, the corporation could be dissolved, as having served its purpose. The native stockholders were paid back their money, with 15% interest per annum, for the time they had had their money invested. This interest had been paid to them annually. The other stockholders received their money back, with 7.5% interest. And Mr. Duncan now personally took over all the business and the property, including the 2 steamers in the meantime acquired, boats, barges, nets, and the entire stock of lumber, merchandise, and canned salmon on hand. Since that time, all of the business has been carried on by him personally, with the aid of trusted native employees in the different departments. In the month of June, 1890, the village had the honor of receiving the first official visit of the Governor of Alaska, the Honorable Lyman E. Knapp. The governor arrived on a United States revenue cutter on Sunday, but so strict was the Sabbath observance rule at Metlakahtla that even the governor of the territory could not be officially received until the following day, when a platform was erected near the beach and a reception held for him. Speeches were delivered by leading natives and by the governor, who promised to do all in his power to secure them an established and definite right to the island, and what they always have so much desired, citizenship. The first of these rights was accorded to them by Congress the next year, but the boon of citizenship is still being withheld from them, though President Roosevelt, in his admirable message to Congress in 1905, strongly urged upon that body to grant this privilege to the Metlakahtla Indians, whom he did not hesitate in his interesting state paper to characterize as highly intelligent and civilized, and fully entitled to all the rights and privileges of citizenship. Congress, however, failed to act up to his suggestion in this matter, as in so many others. Subsequent events have shown that the temper of Congress with reference to granting citizenship or the right to acquire citizenship to any other than Caucasians and Negroes was such that there was no hope of passing an act allowing these highly civilized Indians the right to become naturalized, a right which is freely granted every day in the year to other much less intelligent and patriotic aliens. Senator Knute Nelson of Minnesota, who has taken a great interest in the welfare of Metlakahtla, therefore, on February 4, 1907, introduced a bill to grant them the right to obtain licenses as pilots, captains, and engineers, and to run and operate their own motor boats with the same force and effect as if they were citizens of the United States. This bill, by kindly aid of President Roosevelt, then, as always, the determined friend of the Metlakahtlans, who instructed the Department of Commerce and Labor to take all proper steps to secure its prompt passage, became a law in the very short time remaining of that session of Congress, and on the 4th day of March, A.D. 1907, received the signature of the President. It is to be hoped that in the near future Congress will see that it cannot any longer afford to refuse to these civilized and intelligent men the right of citizenship, which was explicitly promised them, as they thought, with the full approval of the national government, by the governor of Alaska when they first came to this country. In the summer of 1891, things had progressed so far at Metlakahtla that 6,000 cans of salmon were canned, and over $10,000 paid to the natives in wages from this branch of the industries alone. That winter saw 95 new permanent dwellings erected. Since then, their number has been added to, so that there now are 130 private dwellings all told in the village. On November 5, 1892, the second steam sawmill erected by Mr. Duncan in the village was destroyed by fire, at the net loss of nearly $9,000. This second fire, which was due to the carelessness of one of the native operators, determined Mr. Duncan to make use of the splendid water power obtained from the lake in the clouds, filling an old crater about 800 feet above sea level in the mountain valley of Purple Mountain, located on the other side of the bay, and the overflow of which tumbles down the mountainside. At the expense of $9,000, he now built a dam at the mouth of this lake, and a pipeline down the mountainside and around the bay, and thereby not only provided water power for the new sawmill, which now was being run by a Pelton water wheel, but also furnished all necessary water for the cannery, and, in addition, a splendid water supply for the use of the whole village. The business affairs of the colony were now in such shape that this new work was done, the mill rebuilt, and the new machinery purchased, without Mr. Duncan having to call on his friends outside for any help whatsoever. The 12th day of February, 1893, was a sad day in the history of Metlakahtla. For several weeks a north wind had been blowing. The north winds in that part of Alaska always bring fine weather. There had been no rain at all for a long time, and everything in the village was as dry as tinder. A veritable gale from the northeast was blowing, when, near noon, the fire bell clanged. People looked at each other with fear and trembling. An awful day for a fire. Where was it? Fortunately, it had started in the western portion of the village. In an hour or two, all of that part of the village, except 2 houses which miraculously escaped unscathed, though located directly in the path of the flames, some 20 dwellings in all, with the contents of most of them, were wiped out of existence by the fierce fire fiend. The best fire department in the world could have done nothing under the circumstances. The flames simply kept on licking all with voracious tongues till no more food for them could be found. Here was a beautiful opportunity for the Metlakahtla people to show what Christianity had done for them, and they did not fail. Not only did neighbors make room for those who had no home, but in less than 2 days, $1,600 to be distributed among the fire sufferers was raised right in the little village, and about $1,000 of the amount came from the poor natives themselves, though they were at this very time struggling hard to recover from the losses entailed upon them when they had to give up all that was theirs for the sake of their faith. As soon as news of the misfortune reached the outside, God touched many hearts, and in a very short time nearly $3,000 in money and contributions in natura came for the benefit of the sufferers, $1,000 of this amount from a gentleman in London, England, Henry S. Welcome, Esquire, who on this occasion, and not for the first time, showed his great interest in Mr. Duncan and the Metlakahtla Indians. This fire stirred the village council up to procure at once 4 hand pumps, with hose, for fire protection. 2 fire bells were also bought to be placed in different parts of the town. A bucket and ladder company was organized. Cisterns were located near the houses. In short, many measures for better protection against fire were now taken. Within a year, the burned district was rebuilt, thanks especially to the timely aid granted. In 1893, ground had been broken for the magnificent church to be erected in the village, the building of which had been delayed so long only because it was Mr. Duncan's aim to build a church that would in every way be an honour to the place. In April 1894, the raising of the heavy framework was commenced in earnest, and on Christmas Day 1896 could be dedicated and used for the first time what many people are pleased to call Mr. Duncan's Westminster Abbey, even unto this day the largest church in Alaska, and most certainly a magnificent temple of worship. It is 100 feet long, has a 70-foot span, is 43 feet to the ceiling, and the tops of the spires on the towers are 80 feet above the ground. The cost of this edifice, where everything except the fine pipe organ and the gas fixtures is the work of the natives, was a little over $10,000. Of this amount, the natives themselves had contributed $2,500. About $3,000 had been taken from the Benevolent Fund, 1/2 from the amount already mentioned as having been contributed by friends in England and the United States at an earlier period, and the other half from later contributions for the express purpose of helping Mr. Duncan to build this beautiful temple to God. But by far the greater amount, about $4,500, was donated by Mr. Duncan himself from his own private funds. The church is heated by a hot water plant, and is lighted by acetylene gas. The cost of maintaining it, by way of repairs and painting needed, therein included in the cost of the lighting plant, from January 1897 to July 1st, 1908, was the sum of $2,751.30. This does not include pastors, organists, janitors, or any other salaries. All these services are, at Metlakahtla, given gratuitously. Of this amount, the natives have, by their Thanksgiving and New Year's offerings, since 1896, raised the sum of $2,144.90. There are no collections taken at the regular services. From offerings by the tourists of the different excursions visiting Metlakahtla during the last 12 years, the total sum of $1,005.99 has been received. So there was, on the 1st day of July, 1908, on hand in the church fund, a balance of $400. For a long time after the removal, travel about the streets of Metlakahtla was, after heavy rains, and heavy rains are of rather frequent occurrence in the country where the annual rainfall is usually about 120 inches, a decidedly unpleasant undertaking. But in the 90s, it was concluded to obtain, on credit from Mr. Duncan, planks to the amount of $2,000 and to apply the village tax, which in 1889 had been fixed at $3 per annum for each adult, to work on the streets. In this, as in almost all Alaska towns, the streets consisted of plank walks. From 1895 to 1900, considerable work was done, and in the latter year, the planking of the village streets had been completed. During these 5 years, from $600 to $1,000 was every year expended in cash and labor in and about planking the streets. In 1903, the total expenditure on village improvements was $1,300, and in 1906, when the whole of the front street was replanked for a distance of about 1 mile, the public work expenditure exceeded $1,500. In 1897, Mr. Duncan finished the guest house, another strange octagonal-shaped building, which is completely furnished, including 7 bedrooms upstairs, drawing room, library, dining room, and a very elaborate kitchen downstairs. Mr. Duncan says he has built it for his successor. Perhaps that is the reason he declines positively to move into it himself, for it is in every way more convenient and suitable than the little house containing his den. His private library is, however, installed in this building. Mr. Duncan's reasons for the many gables and sides of his building are, first, that he thinks it gives greater strength to resist the winds which in the winter season can be very violent at Metlakahtla, and the next, because he expects thereby to secure better ventilation, as he in the town hall has provided a ventilator in the top portion of every one of the 12 gables. In 1905, the last public building to be erected at Metlakahtla, a combination of jail, engine house, and public library building, was completed. It is painted in all the national colors. The first story is red, as befits an engine house, if not a jail. The library story is painted in white, and the cupola in blue. The jail portion is a perfectly perfunctory institution. The only occupant I have ever known it to have is now and then a small boy whose mother cannot manage him, and gets Mr. Duncan to help her by placing him under restraint for a few hours. In the summer of 1908, an incorrigible girl had a taste of jail life for a day. The public library, housed in the second story, was installed in the winter of 1905 and 1906. It is the largest public library in Alaska, and contains 2,077 volumes, viz. 353 volumes of religious books, 329 of history, geography, travels, and biography, 38 of politics, government, and political economy, 845 of fiction, 265 of miscellaneous books, 70 of music, and 265 of reference books. The latter cannot be removed from the library, and must be used there. The library is kept open for a couple of hours every Saturday night. The books in the library most prized by the natives are 2 volumes of presidential addresses and state papers, presented to the library by President Roosevelt, and bearing upon the flyleaf of the first volume, in the President's own handwriting, the inscription, "With good wishes for the Metlakahtla Indians, from Theodore Roosevelt, October 8, 1905. Among other books contained in the library is a full set of President Roosevelt's works in beautiful morocco binding, a deluxe edition of the Universal Anthology, 32 volumes, a full set of the United States Digest, of the American Digest, and of the United States Compiled Statutes, a deluxe edition of Talmage's Sermons, 21 volumes, an old edition of Plutarch's Lives, 6 volumes, printed in London in 1758, complete sets of all the works of Dickens, Thackeray, Marryat, Scott, Wilkie Collins, Hall Caine, Fenimore J. Cooper, Ralph Connor, George Eliot, Mary A. Fleming, Rider Haggard, Hawthorne, Mary Holland, Anthony Hope, Bulwer Lytton, Henty, Carleton, Emma Southworth, and Mark Twain. Several modern encyclopedias, dictionaries, and Bible dictionaries are also found on the shelves. The library was called from the private libraries of prominent citizens of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and several publishing houses, such as the Fleming H. Revell Company, Funk and Wagnalls Company, S.S. Scranton Company, the Hope Publishing Company, and the West Publishing Company also made valuable contributions from their publications. The Northern Pacific Railway Company and the Alaska Steamship Company carried the library books free of expense to their destination, and Mr. Duncan kindly housed and shelved them. A catalogue of the books in the library has been printed and can be obtained from the librarian for 50 cents. As the proceeds from the sale are devoted to meeting the expenses of the library, anyone who desires to contribute for that purpose can do so by forwarding 50 cents in postage stamps to the librarian of the public library at Metlakahtla for a copy of the catalogue. It will prove interesting as a memento of the great work done there. The natives, who obtain books without any fee or charge whatsoever, have taken out about 100 library cards, and the library is fairly well patronized. On October 2nd, 1907, the 50th anniversary of Mr. Duncan's arrival at Fort Simpson was celebrated at Metlakahtla. It at first was intended to have a central general celebration of the day, either at Port Simpson or Old Metlakahtla, and an invitation was extended to Mr. Duncan to come over there, but he absolutely declined to go where old wounds could not help being reopened. So the natives of Metlakahtla resolved to celebrate the anniversary at their own home. They all gathered early in the town hall, which was decorated with evergreens, festoons, and flags. 4 of the elders made impressive and touching addresses, interspersed with prayer, and 4 beautiful anthems were sung by the church choir. The room was then transformed into a banquet hall, where at 3 p.m. 300 people were seated, and the good women of Metlakahtla served a most excellent dinner, while the Metlakahtla brass band furnished choice music. A fine leather-covered chair was presented to Mr. Duncan by his people. John Tate and Sidney Campbell, who both were present when he landed at Fort Simpson 50 years ago, addressed him at length in words of appreciation of his life and labor among them, and pledged themselves and the people to love him better than ever in the future. Mr. Duncan, on being led to the chair, spoke at length in Tsimshian, rehearsing, like a Moses or Joshua of old, all that God had wrought for them those many years. The Reverend J. A. Chapman, a Methodist preacher of Ketchikan, some 17 miles distant, then spoke. The crowning event of the day, however, was the rendering by a choir of 40 native voices, in most excellent manner, of Handel's renowned oratorio, Messiah, under the leadership of Edward Marsden, with Benjamin A. Haldane at the organ. The 13th of June, 1908, was the 50th anniversary of the preaching by Mr. Duncan of his first sermon in Tsimshian. The day was remembered in prayer in every house at Metlakahtla, but no public celebration occurred. Mr. Duncan does not care much for anniversaries, and the celebration on October 2nd, 1907, would probably never have taken place had it depended on him. The fact remains, however, that the wonderful work which has been done, and the remarkable results which we find in the beautiful village of Metlakahtla, are practically, under God, the sole work of this one man, and others undoubtedly feel that the memory of this fact should be kept green, however much he personally, by reason of his innate modesty, may deprecate it. We have seen that, with the exception of 5 years, when he had the benefit of the invaluable services of Mr. Tomlinson and Dr. Blewett Duncan, he, while at Old Metlakahtla, had practically no help in his work, except that of the native teachers, which he himself had educated. Most of the time he has labored in Alaska, he has been in the same position. And, when this has been so, it is not because he was not willing to secure the aid of competent and able assistants. Time after time they have come to him, and gone again after a short stay. It is not given to everyone to endure the isolation and solitude of the position, as he has been able to do. It is not as easy a matter as one might imagine. The climate is trying. The difficulties of the work are manifold. The life becomes almost that of a hermit. It may be that Mr. Duncan has so long been accustomed to being monarch of all he surveys, that assistants chafe under the form of government, which he has unwittingly established at Metlakahtla. I think it may safely be characterized as an absolute monarchy, although the monarch is both kind, pleasant, and lovable. The hand that rules Metlakahtla wears a velvet glove, but the hand is there, within the glove, just the same, all the time. After Dr. Bluett Duncan left, Dr. H. J. Minthorn, with wife and daughter, spent nearly 3 years on the island on 2 different occasions. They are remembered and beloved for their many kindnesses and valuable services, he as a doctor, and his wife and daughter as teachers. After an interval of 1 year, the village had a new doctor, in Dr. Ernest R. Pike, who with his wife spent there a honeymoon of 2 years, from 1899 to 1901. Thomas Boyd, who had studied medicine in Ireland, came to act both as missionary teacher and as doctor, and filled both positions to the satisfaction of all parties concerned, from February 1903 to December 1904, when he, on account of failing health, was compelled to return to Europe, where he ere long died, leaving an estimable wife and lovely little daughter, the first white child born on Annette Island. When Mr. Duncan first came to Alaska, the government offered him assistance in the educational branch of his work, and allowed him $1,200 per year, with which to pay a teacher or teachers in his school. When he had received this help for about 6 years, and that it was a welcome one during those trying years, we may well imagine, a rule was promulgated that the Bible should not be taught in any school in Alaska supported by governmental aid. When Mr. Duncan learned of this, he immediately refused to receive another $1 of government money. "The Bible will not be exiled from any school that I have anything to do with," he said. The same grand old man. "This one thing I do." Other missionaries in Alaska circumvented the order. They had their Bible reading and studying, but at special sessions. Then they adjourned, and walking the children around the building, came in again and organized the school. Mr. Duncan was, however, too great a man for such tricks. Let the money go. God would give help, and he has. Of the white teachers who have come and gone at Metlakahtla, besides those already mentioned, we may note Mr. and Mrs. J. F. McKee, from Pennsylvania, from April to October, 1892. E. W. Wiesner and wife, Quakers, from August 1893 to October 1894. John H. Hadley and wife, from Iowa, from August to December 1897. And Miss Daisy Stromstedt, from September 1 to November 1, 1906. David Leask was, till he died in 1899, a great help to Mr. Duncan in the schoolroom, and during the last 4 or 5 years, his daughter, Martha Leask, has been employed the greater part of the time. Alonzo Hamblett, a half-breed, with a good education, served as teacher in 1897 and 1898. I will frankly admit that of late years the children have not received the attention they should, and which their fathers and mothers in their youth received from Mr. Duncan personally. His many duties make it impossible for him to personally give the time he would like to the education of the young. Mr. Duncan sees this as well as anyone, and he sincerely regrets that he, unfortunately, has been unable to help matters. He hopes that different results may be expected now, as he has secured the services as schoolmaster of an earnest Christian gentleman, Mr. Bertram G. Mitchell, formerly principal of the public schools in Ketchikan, Alaska, who with his wife removed to Metlakahtla in August 1908. But if he has had bad luck in getting schoolmasters who would make a long stay at Metlakahtla, he has certainly been most fortunate in having with him, for all of 10 years, an excellent Scotch couple, Mr. and Mrs. James Wallace. During all these years, Mrs. Wallace has faithfully tried to make Mr. Duncan's home as pleasant for him as it could be made by a neat and most excellent housekeeper. And Mr. Wallace has, by discharging the duties of postmaster and wharfinger, as well as by taking care of the excellent fruit and vegetable garden, himself been a great help and comfort to Mr. Duncan. All the more pity that he, after this year, will miss their valuable assistance and pleasant Christian society, as they intend to go south and settle on their beautiful little farm near Portland, Oregon. When we do not count the schoolmasters, who, for the last 10 years, have occasionally flitted so far north for very short and limited periods, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace have been the only white people permitted to live at Metlakahtla, with the exception of an old French-Canadian, Jeremiah Zoret, who claims to be over 105 years old, but who probably, in fact, is not over 95. He was at Fort Simpson before Mr. Duncan, married a Tsimshian woman, moved with the natives to Old Metlakahtla, and also to Alaska. He is quite a factor on the island, inasmuch as he has 3 children, 18 grandchildren, and 17 great-grandchildren, but is hardly possessed of the sterling qualities of the natives, who stand far above him in intelligence and education. There were 823 natives who emigrated to New Metlakahtla. Since that time, a few new residents have been added to the colony, but not many, and a few have left, some for the old place, but more for other places in Alaska, notably Ketchikan, where they have a better opportunity to earn more wages. The last census of the village, in the summer of 1908, shows a population of only 683. This decrease in the population is mainly due to the excessive mortality rate. While southeastern Alaska is not an unhealthy country at all, in fact, someone has jocularly said that no one dies there except from accident or old age. Still, it must be admitted that the adoption of the clothing and food of the whites by the natives does not seem to have added anything to the condition of their health and strength. Quite the opposite is the sad actuality. Tuberculosis and pulmonary troubles generally seem to be the prevailing causes of death, while a couple epidemics of influenza and one of whooping cough have claimed their share of victims. According to the records, which however are not very complete as to the cause of death, there have not been less than 55 deaths from the White Plague, out of a total of 502 deaths, as against only 452 births, recorded from the time of removal to Alaska up to July 1, 1908. Footnote: as no particular records of birth is kept at Metlakahtla, only of children brought into the church the first Sunday of each year to be prayed for, it is quite likely that there have been considerably many more births than here stated. It is perhaps fair to estimate that at least 50% of the 146 children given as have died in infancy were never so presented, and that the probable true number of births would come nearer 525 than as above given. But even so, this certainly shows a bad condition of things. End of footnote. Of the deaths, 146 were of infants, 106 of children from 2 to 10 years, and 63 of adolescents from 10 to 20 years old. Some 24 deaths were caused by accident, mostly drowning. One old woman died at an age exceeding 90 years. She was married and had children before the white people first came to Nass River in 1832. 26 of the deaths were of people between 80 and 90, 20 of between 70 and 80, the same number between 60 and 70, and 26 between 50 and 60. So it seems that if a native can manage to get through childhood, he has a pretty fair prospect of longevity. The death rate among children, which is so much greater in proportion than in the settlements in the States, is perhaps in a large measure due to the exposure which follows from the habit of taking their families along and camping out at their logging, fishing, and trapping tours. But I cannot doubt that the change in the building of their houses, which precludes the ventilation and constant supply of fresh air, which their old mode of building with the central fireplace and the large opening in the roof for the escape of smoke ensured, has considerably to do with the waning health and deplorably excessive death rate among these people. This state of things, of course, affects the parents as well as the children. Some remedy must certainly be found for this high mortality rate in the near future, or the funeral knell of the whole race will soon be sounded. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Flotsam and Jetsam. No more beautiful sight meets the eyes of an excursionist in Alaska than the vista that this little village presents on a sunlit day as the steamer approaches it. What first attracts the eye is perhaps the curious little island which lies right across the entrance to the bay, and very properly has been called Duncan's battleship. It takes very little imagination to believe, when at some distance, that a real battleship is anchored at the inlet to the harbor. Passing along, one notices the beautiful little Good Time Island, as the natives call it, and then looms in full sight the magnificent Purple Mountain, which towers above the sea some 2,500 feet, with the silvery strip of a waterfall leaping down its dizzy height from the lake in the clouds. To the right, and directly behind the church, is Yellow Hill, so called from its peculiar color, caused by the action of the elements on the serpentine building stone, of which this immense rocky ridge consists. Then what first attracts the eye are the public buildings on Mission Street, and especially the magnificent church, all in glorious white coats. Below these buildings, and nearer to the beach, are strewn around, in the luxurious verdure of the gardens, the houses of the natives, painted in all colors, pink, green, light and dark, orange, lemon, gray, and white, the latter two colors predominating. No one approaching this peaceful little village doubts that it is a place of happy homes. Everything indicates it, and if you know something about what a model village lies before you, you certainly do not doubt that peace and happiness here reign supreme. We assuredly can most properly call it a model village, for upon inquiry we learn that in this little town a glass of liquor cannot be had for love or money, that a pipe or cigar is never seen within its limits except when the tourists bring them along, that one never hears there, from one end of the year to the other, God's name taken in vain, or any oath of any kind uttered, that when Sunday comes, the quiet and peace of the true Sabbath rest over the village, not an axe is lifted to chop kindling, not a pail of water is carried, not an oar is dipped into the sea until after the last service is over Sunday night at 8:30. All of these people come as near living a consistent Christian life, loving each other, caring for the poor and nursing the sick, as any Christian community in the land, or, for all that, in any land. So many people have an idea that all of Alaska is a refrigerator, that it may be proper here to say that the winters in this part of Alaska are not at all cold. The influence of the Kuroshiwo, or Japanese current, which circles around the islands, prevents excessive cold. As a general thing, the thermometer does not go below the freezing point, and as only on 2 or 3 occasions during the last 20 years it has been known to go down to 0 or under. So while snow lies all winter on the mountains, and across Clarence Strait on the higher mountains of Prince of Wales Island all summer too, at Metlakahtla it hardly ever stays more than a day or two, and it is not by any means every year that the young people can enjoy the sport of skating on the little lake back of the village. But whenever the winter is cold enough to freeze the lake over, skating parties are the order of the day, and even a picnic party on the ice is not considered any less the proper thing than the summer picnic parties in the forests in the States. On account of the mild weather in the winter, there is not a plastered house in Metlakahtla. In fact, there is no necessity for it. Nor are there any screens protecting doors or windows, as there are no mosquitoes in the summer. Even on a warm day in the summer, the refreshing sea breezes see to it that the thermometer hardly ever climbs any higher than 80 degrees. The nights following on a warm day are always refreshingly cool. The climate here has, however, its drawbacks. Both in summer and winter, and especially in the winter, there is an enormously heavy rainfall. Some years it has even exceeded 120 inches. In the winter time, there are further very disagreeable windstorms, occasionally lasting for days in succession, when access to the harbor is almost impossible. But as soon as spring comes, the flowers peep forth. It is not an uncommon sight to see in the Metlakahtla gardens anemones, primroses, daisies, and forget-me-nots in full bloom in the first days of May. Yea, in some earlier years, at the commencement of the second half of April, when even the grass in the Middle West has not commenced to put on its summer coat. Wildflowers and wild berries grow profusely all over the island. Among the latter may be mentioned the salmonberry, the thimbleberry, the cloudberry, the blueberry, the blue and red huckleberry, and the whortleberry. The natives grow in their gardens strawberries, raspberries, black currants, and gooseberries. There are several crabapple trees and cherry trees. 2 years ago, scions from apple trees growing on the west coast of Norway, under practically the same climatic conditions, were imported and grafted, and are now growing finely, transplanted into the native gardens. All sorts of vegetables, especially potatoes, are raised by the Metlakatlans. Since a friend of Metlakahtla, some 4 years ago, commenced to give prizes every year for the best flower gardens in the village, greater care has been bestowed on the gardens. New fences have been procured and neatly painted. Flower beds have been laid out in a very artistic and original manner, taking all sorts of shapes: halibut, starfish, half-moons, crosses, anchors, and hearts. In one garden a battleship was built, with a rose bush climbing up through the smokestack, and a little furred animal peeping up from out of the forehold. Rose bushes of all kinds, bearing luscious roses, pink, red, white, and yellow, have been procured and planted, and the gardens are gay with pansies, tiger lilies, dahlias, and peonies, not to speak of daisies in all colours, and forget-me-nots of the most beautiful bright blue hue, much bluer than they are ever seen in the States. The garden which the first year received the first prize is the only one at Metlakahtla which can boast of a lawn and a lawn-mower. The lawn party, of which an illustration is found herein, was given in this garden. The question will naturally arise whether the interior of the houses of the natives is as attractive as the exterior. My answer is that I suppose there is a great difference between the natives, as among white people, with regard to cleanliness, neatness, and taste. I have seen houses at Metlakahtla where I would not particularly care to sit down to eat a meal. But I have also been in houses there where everything was as scrupulously clean and neat as in any house of the same class of people, the ordinary working class, which I have ever entered in the States. There are carpets on the floor, in most cases linoleum, fair pictures on the wall, good useful furniture, much bric-a-brac on the shelf over the fireplace, curtains at the windows, draperies at the doors, musical instruments for the girls to play on, while everything, including the kitchen and the kettles and dishes, are scrupulously clean. The mere fact that there are at Metlakahtla 2 pianos and 46 organs will give an idea of the love of these people for music, and I might say right here that none of them are bought for ornament. They are faithfully used. Wherever one is found, it is the rule, not the exception, that the parents as well as the children, over 12 or 13 years of age, can and do play on it. The Metlakahtla Brass Band, of 30 pieces, is well known all over southeastern Alaska. In 1904, it, contrary to Mr. Duncan's advice, made a concert tour covering some of the Pacific Coast cities. Owing to poor management, the boys lost money on the tour, for which they had bought new silver-plated instruments at an expense of over $2,000. But those who heard them were full of admiration for the native talent. In addition to the brass band, there is at Metlakahtla a reed band, a string band, an orchestra, a ladies' orchestra, and a girls' zobo band. The church choir, consisting of 24 members, comprises some very beautiful voices. A captain of one of the visiting warships once said to Mr. Duncan, after hearing the congregational singing in the church on Sunday, "Why, you have the voices of prima donnas here." And I am not surprised at the remark. I have heard in the church in this village voices so sweet and clear that I can well understand that proper cultivation could produce a counterpart of a Patti's or a Melba's wonderful register. Many of the young people play several different instruments. There are no less than 4 men and 1 woman among them who can handle the pipe organ in the church very effectually. Mr. Haldane I have heard play on the piano, with great skill and feeling, difficult compositions of Grieg, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, and Chopin, which he had never laid eyes on or heard before. Mrs. Lucy A. Booth, the best soprano among them, reads music readily, and sings the score at once without practice. The old Tsimshian love song, which is here reproduced, is one of her favourite songs, and was sung by her before Mr. Haldane, who wrote the music for me from her singing. The canoe song, which is also here reproduced, is an old national song of theirs, and was sung for me by John Tate. Almost all Tsimshian men and women are born actors and speakers. Even in ordinary conversation, their soft, flowing speech is accompanied by a mimicry and a gesticulation which makes one almost feel that one understands the strange language falling from their lips. Public speaking with the men seems to come as naturally as singing to the women. Their delivery is very effective, never ranting, often indeed it is pathetic and pleading. Their flow of language is continuous. You never hear one stutter or stammer or hesitate. They impress you as being full of their subject, whether speaking on religious or secular matters, and as being earnest and honest in what they have to tell you. The modulation is wonderful. The gesticulation is never extravagant. Many times, indeed, it is exceedingly persuasive and always natural. The imagery of the native eloquence is something remarkable in its simple beauty. It is always strictly correct. Let me give one example, taken from a religious exhortation by George Usher, now deceased. Brethren and sisters, you know the eagle and its ways. The eagle flies high. The eagle rests high. It always rests on the highest branch of the highest tree. We should be like the eagle. We should rest on the highest branch of the highest tree. That branch is Jesus Christ. When we rest on Him, all our enemies will be below and far beneath us. Mr. Duncan says that he has never heard even a little child among them speak ungrammatically. The Tsimshians are great lovers of all athletic sports, an inclination which Mr. Duncan from an early day thought it well to encourage. The Metlakahtla Baseball Nine is easily the champion team in southeastern Alaska. Of late years have been formed the second and third team. There is also at Metlakahtla a football team. Governor Swineford, soon after the Metlakahtlans came to Alaska, encouraged Mr. Duncan in forming and drilling a company of volunteers, and promised to furnish uniforms and accoutrements. In compliance with this request, the Metlakahtla volunteers were formed and drilled assiduously for more than 2 years, when the governor informed Mr. Duncan that the judge of the district had decided that he could not legally encourage a company of volunteers among them, inasmuch as they were not citizens, whereupon the company was regretfully disbanded. I have already, in a footnote, stated that the Tsimshian calls his cousins, on the mother's side, brothers and sisters, and treats them as such. Even to this day, no Tsimshian with a proper regard for the ancient rule will marry any one of his mother's clan or totem. Do not be surprised, should you visit one of them, if he, after having introduced you to his mother, says, "And this is my mother," and again, "And this is also my mother." All of his aunts, his mother's sisters, are his mothers. That is the explanation. Another peculiarity, even to this day, a woman is most generally not spoken of in the village as Mrs. So-and-so. If her first child's name is Emma, the name that the mother goes by is Nos Emma, Emma's mother. Her husband generally is Nugwada Emma, Emma's father. If they have no children, but happen to have a pet in the family like a dog, they are spoken of as the father and mother of the dog, naming it. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, for instance, being a childless couple, were among the natives generally designated as Nugwa Molly and Nos Daisy, respectively, as they saw Mr. Wallace milk and take care of Molly, Mr. Duncan's cow, and Mrs. Wallace invariably feeding little Daisy, Molly's calf. I will give a few of the most common words in Tsimshian. Nyaj is the common name for either wife or husband. Grandfather is Neyash. Grandmother is Nishits. Nugwado is my father. Nugwadum is our father. A grandchild is Talutogn. Grandchildren, Tluklaghut. Anyone might know what a word like Klemshugmaknak must mean something really bad. It is Tsimshian for mother-in-law. Kemukum Tust is the word for the sun. Kemukum Akt is for the moon, the heater of the day and of the night. Kemuk is heat. Kamukum is the adjective hot, so kamukum oxt is hot water, while simply warm water is spottish-kum oxt, and cold water guat-kum oxt, from guat, the word for chill and coldness. When the Tsimshian wants to tell you that it is a hot day, he will say kamukum sha. The expression for all day, or the whole day, is wuya sha sha. Kat katum coffee means strong coffee, but kat katum oxt is Tsimshian for whiskey. Another name for strong drink is lamb, really applied originally only to rum. The Tsimshian calls spring kohim, summer shud, autumn frishkut, and winter kwam shum. When a Tsimshian wants to be very polite in greeting you, he will say endo willa wan, how do you do? But ordinarily he will simply inquire ahlan willa wam, are you well? And you may with great propriety answer willa walu, I am well. They have no word for thanks or thank you. There is one word for an adjective in the singular, and a different word for its plural. For instance, while hot water is kemukum oxt, as stated, hot potatoes are lemukum shushid. Strong man is kat ketum yuat. Strong men kataletum yuata. The same is the case with verbs. For instance, stand in the singular is haik, in the plural moxt. I stand is hait kanu. He stands hait ka. We stand makshum. They stand makshadat. I will here subjoin for the benefit of the reader the Lord's Prayer and the Apostolic Benediction in Tsimshian given in the Metlakahtla Church Manual. The Lord's Prayer. Winagwadum kutsim lachaga klutish ak nuwant chahakshya ntsabani shakod khan tumwal al halatsohami newotkatim lakaga kinam klagam ashakwa amshkabu winaya kam kwadan nah achtakami nehwal dadi willa kam koadamum ahach hakak adigam. Kelomza ta tjank ampt spijt tin spalt quadumt adama al tilach mauktum aha akhadat. A will natsab bandat ada nakat kitandat tilten cloadant adaktum kla willawal. Amen. The Apostolic Benediction. Na amshk meyanum Jesus Christ tum kla willa hosh kadin gam tilth ni shibanshk shemauket kar la kagakanel amt kite. Amen. The Tsimshian has a superstitious aversion to pronouncing his own name, and will never give it unless it is absolutely necessary. If 2 or more children are together, and you should ask the name of one of them, he will look foolish, as if he did not understand you, and throw a beseeching glance at the others, one of whom will, after the proper pause, help him out of the difficulty by giving his name. The first one will very likely return the favor for the other. The same superstition prevents a parent from giving the age of a child, or the date of its birth. To figure out anything like this might make the child die. It is very touching to see these people's affection for their children. It is carried to such an extent that they often are in danger of spoiling them. When a child is sick, and Mr. Duncan, on inquiry, finds out that it has been given something to eat which it ought not to have had, and asks the mother, "What made you let her have that?" the answer invariably is, "She wanted it, sir." That seems to settle the matter in the mother's mind. An echo of the old potlatch practice may be found in the peculiarity of the Metlakahtlan. When giving you a present, always look for a present in return. They keep strict account of their gifts, and of their expectations. An old man one day came to Mr. Duncan, and asked his help to collect $20 from a party in British Columbia. Upon inquiry as to the nature of the debt, Mr. Duncan ascertained that the old man, 30 years ago, gave the woman's mother, since deceased, on her wedding day, a cloak of the value of $20, and as the mother never had given him any equivalent return present, he perceived that he now had a valid claim for the value of his gift against the daughter, who on her mother's decease had become possessed of her property. As to the Metlakahtlans' faces and general appearance, I prefer to let the photographs given in the present book speak for themselves. As to their manner of dress, it may be said that the men are clothed just about like men of the same class in the States. The women, especially the young women, are perhaps a little inclined to wear gaudier hats and a little brighter shirt-waists than the white people of the same social condition, but not much more so. Many of them exhibit very good taste indeed. The very old women generally wear shawls, and on their heads black silk kerchiefs, tied under the chin, which give them a very sedate and modest appearance. It is remarkable how well most of these people, both men and women, carry their age. Women, whom at first sight I should have judged to be young women of between 30 and 40, on inquiry turned out to be grandmothers of over 50. I know a number of men over 60 years of age, without a gray hair in their heads, and who easily would pass as being under 40. Gray hairs are a matter of very rare occurrence among them anyhow. Only now and then will you see a person of very advanced age with a gray head. The men have, as a general thing, not very much of a hirsute adornment. Now and then we find a scanty mustache. There are only 2 full beards in the village among the natives, and they are not of a very luxurious growth. I have heard this explained by a custom prevalent, more especially in earlier times, of pulling out the hairs of the face as they were first showing themselves. It is remarkable to see the smallness of the hands and feet, especially of the women. Another noticeable feature about these people is their well-preserved teeth. While the teeth are generally ground down, especially among the older people, more than they would be among the whites, there are very few mouths with decaying teeth. There is still more interference on the part of parents and relatives in the way of matchmaking than there ought to be, but Mr. Duncan has, to a great extent, done away with it. When he has an idea that a woman is unduly influenced to marry someone, he acts as he did in the case of a young woman whose parents asked him to marry her to an old man. He called her alone to his office and asked her, "Do you want to marry that old man?" "My parents, sir." "I did not ask if your parents wanted you to. I knew they did. What I want to know is if you want it." "They say I must, sir. They have promised him." "Do you love him?" "No, sir." "Do you like anybody else?" "I don't know, sir." This was with quite an amount of hesitation. "Well, you don't like him in any event." "No, I do not." "Well, then, you shall not marry him either." So that match, which evidently was not made in heaven, was broken off. I need not say that divorces are wholly unknown in Metlakahtla. Practically all the natives at Metlakahtla are common workmen, fishermen, trappers, loggers, and workers in the sawmill or cannery. But some of them are carrying on a private business of their own. Thus there are 5 small native stores, and 2 restaurants in the village, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 silversmiths, 2 photographers, 2 expert wood carvers, several carpenters, 6 or 7 boat builders, and 1 young native man operates a Remington typewriter. A good many of the older women make baskets and mats out of cedar bark for the tourists. The patterns for the mats are quite varied, and many of them are very neat and attractive. In basket making, the Tsimshian women have, however, not acquired either the dexterity or the taste, nor do they use the fine materials of the Tlingit and Haida women, especially the latter, who are experts in this art. When the Tsimshians came to Alaska, their conveyance on the water was the canoe. Mr. Duncan says that, years ago, he counted at one time 28 new canoes building on the beach. A canoe is now a curiosity, and is no longer employed at Metlakahtla. The natives have learned to build the white man's boat, and prefer it as being both stronger, cheaper, and safer. The Columbia River sailing boat has been the style of late years, and there are not fewer than 35 of them owned in the village. But very lately it seems that the gasoline launch is coming to the front. Also among the natives at this place. There are now 9 gasoline launches owned at Metlakahtla, all, with the exception of 2, of quite a good size. Most of them are each 35 or 40 feet long, with from 7 to 8 foot beam, and supplied with good and reliable engines. It is on the water that these natives are especially masters of the situation. Their nautical skill is marvelous, while their knowledge of the channels everywhere in southeastern Alaska is well nigh perfect. They use but do not need charts. In their opinion, there are still too many errors in them, too many rocks and reefs not yet located. And they are right. I went in the summer of 1908 on a cruise of 500 miles with 2 of these natives, in waters wholly new to one of them. The other had not visited them for over 20 years, but his memory never failed him, and he had no use for my chart after he found that a certain rock awash at high tide, and which he had told me about, was not marked on the map. In 10 minutes we came to the place, and there was the rock all right as it had been 20 years ago. To my surprise, I found that the little craft was not furnished with a compass, and still we always found our way over large expanses of open water, as well as in narrow channels where the tide swirls were running wild. Good sailors, good fishers and trappers, good workmen, and even good mechanics as they are, these natives all seem to be lacking in executive ability, and as businessmen they are not a success. Several enterprises undertaken by some of them away from the island have been signal failures. So have some of their small stores, and widows and others who confided to them their little savings under hope and promise of big returns have not only failed to harvest the profits, but have lost their capital invested as well, and this through no dishonesty of purpose on the part of the enterprisers, but wholly for the lack of business energy and ability to carry on the undertaking on proper business lines. Another fault with a good many of these people is their inability to appreciate the necessity of exactness, accuracy, and completeness. A native seldom is on time for an appointment. When a house is built, there is generally something left unfinished. I am inclined to think that these are defects which a more finished education and a generation or 2 of business training will wholly eradicate. The fact remains that these natives in the way of work seem to be able to do everything they see others do, at least when properly instructed, that they are able to complete such complex building undertakings as the 2 large churches built by Mr. Duncan at both of the Metlakahtlas, with the limited apparatus and appliances at hand, without a single mishap or accident, certainly speaks volumes for their ability as mere workmen and mechanics. A stranger cannot fail to be impressed by their excessive politeness and good manners. They always knock at the door before entering. They always remove their caps or hats when coming into Mr. Duncan's office, and address him with marked deference. To ladies and to white men, whom they know and respect, they invariably doff their hats on the street. The other day I noticed the amiable clerk in Mr. Duncan's store, a man over 60 years old, respectfully doff his cap in saying good-bye to a little golden-haired white girl, only about 2 years old, who had just bought 5 cents worth of candy from him. Dropping into Mr. Duncan's store one day in August, 1908, I found several natives present, listening to a phonograph which was reeling off some Columbia records. I was engaged in an interesting conversation with the Reverend Mr. Tomlinson, and paid no particular attention to what tune was played, until I saw the hats and caps of all these uncouth labourers and fishermen come off quickly. I looked up in surprise. Then it struck me that it was the Star-Spangled Banner that was being played. These natives, who were not yet American citizens, had shamed me in paying homage to our country and its flag. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Apostle of Alaska, The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla, by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Metlakahtla Industries. Mr. Duncan's books show that the sum total of the business transacted in his industrial enterprises at Metlakahtla, covering the store, the sawmill, and the cannery, from the beginning in 1887 up to the 1st of July, 1908, was not less than $900,937.31. From these gross proceeds he has, during the same time, paid in wages to the natives the sum of $481,043. The difference between these sums does not, of course, represent the profits of the enterprise. Out of the gross proceeds, the stock in the store, every year renewed, must be paid. Also tin and soldering materials for the millions of cans for the cannery, boats, nets, machinery, lacquering materials and labels, heavy freight bills, insurance of the pack at Seattle, no insurance premiums being paid at Metlakahtla, and a liberal commission to the house handling and selling the pack. During all these years, Mr. Duncan has not only been the preacher and pastor, and most of the time the only physician of the village, without pay or hire, and to a certain extent, at least, schoolmaster of the young, but also the manager, bookkeeper, timekeeper, general overseer, and cashier of this extensive business. And in addition to all this, he is the counselor of every man, woman, and child, the arbiter of all their little troubles, the comforter in their sorrows and adversity, the adviser on all matters of policy, economy, and health, both private and public. The sawmill and planing mill, by employing loggers as well as sawyers and mill hands, have contributed a good deal towards furnishing many in the village with their means of subsistence. But it is on the cannery that Mr. Duncan mainly relies for employing the idle hands of the village at a fair compensation. It is a great pity that this business can be carried on only for a short time during the year. The canning process is practically limited to 2 months, July and August, when the salmon are running, as it is called. For the benefit of those who know nothing about the life and habits of the salmon, let me explain. The salmon is hatched in some freshwater lake, the headwaters of some little stream where the spawn is deposited. After living for some months in this lake, the young salmon gradually works its way down the stream towards the ocean and disappears. No one knows where it goes to, or where it dwells. Only this is known: in 4 years it attains full size. It then returns by thousands, yea, by millions, to the same stream, leading to the same lake where it was once hatched. Footnote: how is it able to find the exact way, through thousands of miles of ocean? How can it locate the stream whence it came? How can it distinguish it from others just like it? No one has attempted to explain, but it is a settled fact. Each stream in Alaska has its peculiar salmon coming to it, and up it, and no other. Young salmon have been marked and found to return to their native lake. Never, in a single instance, has a marked salmon been found in the wrong stream. What a lesson in the guiding force of an almighty power. End of footnote. It gradually works its way up the stream, jumping up the waterfalls from rock to rock, often leaping as high as 7 feet in one jump. Sometimes the first effort fails, then it tries, and tries again until successful. Onward and upward it progresses, until it reaches the breeding ground in its native lake, sore and torn, disheveled and disfigured from its rocky path, from its enervating, exhausting efforts to get there. When arriving at the spawning ground, the first work undertaken is that of the male. Burrowing with its nose and pushing his body again and again into the sand, he makes deep furrows, so after a while the spawning ground looks as if a plough had gone over it. Then comes the turn of the female. She places herself in the furrow and deposits the spawn. The male then fertilizes it. This done, she covers it with her wriggling tail with sand. The life work of the salmon is now ended, and it is ready to die. These lakes soon become filled with putrid fish, emitting such an odor that it is almost impossible to approach them. Some of the salmon have life enough left to wriggle themselves down the stream, but most of these die before they reach the ocean. Those that do get back die there and are washed ashore by the tide. It is when approaching these, their native streams in large shoals, the salmon are caught in nets or seines, or traps, by the fishermen and brought to the canneries. Sometime after they have touched fresh water, varying according to the distance they have to travel upstream, they become soft and flabby and unfit to eat. In the different streams, the estuaries of which the cannery at Metlakahtla draws upon for its salmon, there are 4 different kinds of salmon running: the red salmon, the sockeye, in Tsimshian, mesho, the medium red salmon, the coho, in Tsimshian, gua, the pink salmon, or the humpback, in Tsimshian, shta-maun, and the white salmon, called chum, or dog salmon, in Tsimshian, knish. The latter, though a very good salmon, but not so fat as the others, is put up only in a very limited extent at Metlakahtla. Japan has been the single market for it, until lately, when it has, with considerable success, been introduced in the south, where it seems to suit better, as the hot climate makes a dry fish preferable to an oily one. The first work done in a cannery is in the spring and early summer, when the cans are manufactured, as the capacity of the machinery at Metlakahtla enables it to pack 20,000 cases of salmon, consisting of 48-pound cans each. Nearly 1,000,000 tin cans must first be made, also 20,000 boxes of planed boards. This work employs a force of about 100 men and boys for about 2 months, at wages varying from $1 to $2 per day. Immediately after the 4th of July, the fishermen are started out with their boats and nets, and the steamers make their daily rounds of from 40 to 70 miles to gather up the salmon catch and bring it to the cannery. There it first goes through the hands of the cutters, who remove the head, tail, and fins, and disembowel the fish. It is then turned over to the cleaners, who clean it thoroughly in 2 running waters, whereupon it is cut up into proper lengths on a machine and delivered in trays to the women, who put it in cans. The cans, after being filled, are wiped clean and a spring cover put on them. Then the cover is soldered, and the cans put in the boiler for the first cooking. After this first cooking, a hole is punched in each can to allow all the air to escape. Then the hole is immediately filled up again with solder, and the can replaced in the boiler for its second cooking. After being thoroughly cleaned and all grease and oil removed, they are allowed to cool. They are then thoroughly tested by experts, who tap each can, and by the sound can determine if there is a leak in any one can. All leaks are set aside and carefully examined until the leak is found, when it is closed with solder. In most canneries, the cans are now at once lacquered, labeled, and marketed. Not so at Metlakahtla. The lacquer will often temporarily close a leak. After a while, however, the leak reappears, and the result is a more or less spoilt can of salmon when it reaches the consumer. In order to obviate this, the cans at Metlakahtla are, after cooling, piled up till the season is over. Then they are again tested, new leaks closed up, and then, and only then, are they lacquered and labeled, put into cases, and made ready for the steamer, to be by it carried to the commission house in Seattle, Kelly, Clark & Company, who finally dispose of them to the wholesale trade. The entire work in the cannery at Metlakahtla is done by the Indians, under the constant supervision of Mr. Duncan, from early morn till late at night. The people who do the work are scrupulously clean. None other are allowed to handle the salmon. Tables, floors, and trays are scoured and cleaned thoroughly every day, so that after a day's work is done, one, on peeking into the cannery, would not know but that it was one's own kitchen he was poking his nose into. There are canneries where putrid salmon is put into cans. The Chinese are under contract to fill them, and they have no very bothersome consciences. Of course, Mr. Duncan could not tolerate such conduct for a moment in his cannery. Once in a while, one comes across a sick salmon. This can always be discovered by the touch of the human hand. In most canneries, the filling is done by machinery, which of course takes the salmon whether it be sick or well. Not so at Metlakahtla. Any piece from a sick salmon is at once discarded, and goes into a pail under the table. Then again, a time comes when the salmon becomes flabby and not in prime condition. This is towards the end of the season, when the salmon is running the strongest. As soon as this is the case, Mr. Duncan closes his cannery. Not another salmon is allowed to be canned. I have known seasons where he closes his cannery quite 14 days earlier than any one of the other canneries in that part of the world. It is his ambition that every can of Metlakahtla salmon shall be up to its reputation as the best salmon canned in Alaska. We can form an idea of the honesty and care with which his, Mr. Duncan's, business is transacted all through, when we hear that every can, when filled, is placed upon a pair of scales, on the other scale of which is a tin can with a pound weight in it. Every can must tip that scale. If it does not, it is returned to the filler for more salmon, and then weighed again before it is accepted. He is bound to give an honest pound of salmon in every can. There is your old, genuine Yorkshire business honesty for you. Some years ago, a friend of mine from Minneapolis came to Metlakahtla on the Spokane after having made a tour of Alaska. After we had been around and inspected the buildings and the church, he mentioned that after having visited the salmon canneries, he had made up his mind never to eat another meal of canned salmon. He could not do it. Have you been through the cannery here? No. I took him along. It so happened that the entire force was at work, and I let him thoroughly inspect the whole process from beginning to end. When we went down to the dock, he said, "I am glad you showed me this. I will make an exception of Metlakahtla salmon, but I will eat no other." Neither do I. The brands manufactured at Metlakahtla are 1. The Mission brand, red salmon; 2. The Metlakahtla brand, medium red salmon; and 3. The Buckle brand, pink salmon. They all have on the label somewhere, packed by the Metlakahtla Industrial Company at Metlakahtla, Alaska, as the label of the old corporation has not been changed. The total pack from 1891 to the end of the season in 1907 was 247,344 cases, or nearly 12 million cans, a manufactured product from over 6,000 tons of salmon. The fishermen employed by Mr. Duncan, and they are, of course, all Metlakahtlans, are paid by the fish, and can earn from $3 to $5 per day. I have seen as many as 10,000 salmon handled in one day, the last of the salmon being ready for the first boiling in 10 hours. The women filling cans are also paid by the piece, and can make from $2 to $2.50 a day. The cutters, the cleaners, the men around the boilers, and the testers are paid wages of from $2 to $3 per day. The women who wipe the cans get $1 per day, the girls who put the covers on them an equal sum, and boys working at different jobs, piling cans, etc., from 50 to 75 cents per day. As very often 3 or 4 members of a family are employed, the total earnings are quite a bit, even if the season is short. The total number on the payroll during the canning season proper varies from 180 to 250. In 1908, it was only 185. Until the pack is sold, or at least until New Year, Mr. Duncan pays his employees only in coupons, good at his general store. At New Year, any balance coming to them is paid in cash. This year, he has promised his people to introduce the profit-sharing element in his cannery business. If there is any profit from the pack, which is not a certainty by any means, as for 3 years in succession some years ago the business proved an absolute loss, he will after the season distribute 1/2 of the net profits between the cannery employees, including the fishermen, in proportion to the wages earned by them already. As all the inhabitants of Metlakahtla cannot find employment in its industries, a number seek work at other places, at canneries and sawmills, especially during the summer season. What Mr. Duncan is looking for, and hopes to accomplish in time, is the operation of so many additional industries, and such extension of those already going, that the whole population can find steady employment on the island all the year round. Small as their wages are, and limited as the capacity for employment is, yet a good many of the Metlakahtlans have managed to save quite a little sum from their earnings. One of their number, not long ago, consulted me in regard to the most profitable investment of $2,000, and several of them, to my knowledge, have a few $100s laid by. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Christian Church. As the life of the Metlakahlans centers round and has its foundations in the religion of the Christ, so naturally every interest in the little village clusters around and culminates in the church. It naturally dominates all and everything. The official name of the Church of Metlakahtla is simply the Christian Church of Metlakahtla. It and its members belong to no sect or denomination. It is strictly an undenominational evangelical church. Its whole creed is found on the beautifully inlaid pulpit, on the ribbon held in the bill of the white dove, God is love, and in the glad gospel message surmounting its preaching platform. The angel saith unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. In this pulpit is welcomed any evangelical preacher, and from its platform have spoken to the people of Metlakahtla Bishop Rowe, the efficient and indefatigable head of the Episcopal Church of Alaska, as well as Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, Presbyterian, and Lutheran ministers and laymen. The only condition exacted is that they preach no ism, but only the pure, simple gospel message of Jesus the Christ crucified. It may, in this connection, be interesting to read Mr. Duncan's views on the propriety and expediency of non-sectarianism in heathen missions. He says, I hold that it would be well if all missionaries, on leaving their several societies to preach the gospel to the heathen, would leave their respective church colors behind them, and take their stand in heathen lands under but one and the same banner, the banner of Christ. If this were done, we would, I believe, not only have less strife and rivalry, ill success and hollowness in mission work, but we would have more reality, more progress, and more victory. Divisions among religious teachers are sad stumbling blocks to the heathen. Bad enough to have divisions at home, but far worse to carry them abroad, to fetter and worry new converts while in the weakness of their pupillage. If, however, denominational differences must ultimately arise among the new converts to divide them as they have divided us, then let, at least, such divisions be inaugurated by themselves, and be attributable to diversity of thought and choice, as with us. As far as we are concerned, let them remain united as long as they can, and divide only when necessity from within demands it. It seems to me worthy of the best sympathies of the Christians at home to foster the desire of newly formed congregations in heathen lands for church unity in the respective countries, and nothing less than simple, unmitigated cruelty to try to divide them for the glory of any church denomination or party. These were his sentiments when he first left England 50 years ago. He was animated by them in his opposition to clapping the manacles of the Church of England on his new converts, and to this day he is true to the convictions of his youth, and has faithfully carried them out in the church formation rather than church organization at Metlakahtla. 3 times a day every Sabbath do the church bells of Metlakahtla call upon the people to attend divine service. The morning service is at 11:30. It is a great sight Sunday morning to see the walks black with people. From all directions they are coming, men, women, and children. As the people are entering the church with solemn mien and stolid faces, while the bells are still pealing out their message of invitation to one and all, a prelude is played on the fine pipe organ, thus far the only one in Alaska. As the last sound of the bell is dying away in the stillness and peace of the place, Mr. Duncan, clothed in a black Prince Albert coat, without even a white tie, or any other clerical vestment or adornment, ascends the preaching platform, and kneels down for silent prayer behind the reading desk. A hymn is then sung in Tsimshian by the congregation, which always rises in singing. Thereupon, Mr. Duncan, kneeling in the pulpit after saying in English, "Let us pray," offers an earnest prayer in Tsimshian, the congregation all kneeling in their seats. At the conclusion of this prayer, which usually takes about 5 minutes, the audience joins with him in the Lord's Prayer, also in Tsimshian. Thereupon, he closes with the apostolic benediction. The congregation now sings a song from Pentecostal hymns, numbers 1 and 2, whereupon the church choir, consisting of 24 excellent voices, gives an anthem. Mr. Duncan rises, approaches the reading desk, and again kneels down for a very short, simple prayer, in English, the audience also again kneeling. He thereupon reads in English the text, which in the forenoon always is in the International Sunday School lesson, the audience following him in their Bibles. Then he begins his sermon, always in Tsimshian. He first paraphrases the portion of the Scriptures read, in Tsimshian, taking pains to make it very plain to his people, and then gives them the message which God's Word has for them on that day. The benign face of the inspired teacher fairly beams, as in a solemn benediction. It seems to be lit up by the light from heaven, and as he explains and reproves, consoles and praises, and points to God's help, the animated face and his impressive gesticulation change, so that one, even though not understanding a word of the language, seems to be able to follow him in his exposition. And after listening to him, one well understands the wonderful hold he has on his people, and how they never tire of hearing him expound the gospel message. In fact, so pronounced are his earnestness, sincerity, and solemnity in speech, as well as in prayer, coupled with the most serene simplicity, that I was not surprised to hear Mr. Wallace remark that he felt more edified by hearing him in Tsimshian, a language he did not understand, than by hearing many ministers preach in English. After a sermon of about 3/4 of an hour, he again says, "Let us pray," and all kneel for a short prayer, at the conclusion of which he, as well as the audience, remains kneeling for a fraction of a minute in silent prayer. The audience now files out, quietly and solemnly, with the Word of God so forcibly imprinted on their minds and in their hearts, reflected in their solemn faces. There is no chatting, no visiting among these church members, either at the church or on the way home. You can see in their faces and in their reverential demeanor that God's word has not been spoken to them in vain. There is no room for levity. It is Mr. Duncan's plan that nothing shall intervene after the word has been sent home to their hearts. For that reason, he never allows at the morning service any closing hymn. It was the same idea which, when he at an early day itinerated around and preached the gospel in their different villages, causing him to order his men to have his canoe ready, so he could start immediately after the service had closed. He did not want to give them any opportunity for familiarity or for fraternizing with him. He wanted to leave the message and remove the messenger from their minds. In the afternoon, at 3:30, the natives have their own service in the church, while Mr. Duncan gathers around him in the schoolroom the smaller children, all under 12 years of age, to a number all the way from 90 to 150, according to the season, and personally conducts their Sabbath school service. On Saturday night he always meets for an hour the Sunday school teachers, and goes over with them the lesson for the next day, explaining and expounding, and advising them how best to teach it, so that they are duly prepared for their duties the next day. The native's own service is conducted by one of the elders, chosen by his fellows for each service. The leader gives out a hymn from the Pentecostal hymns, and offers a prayer in Tsimshian. The classes then separate, and the lesson is studied by each. A photograph of the women Sunday school teachers at Metlakahtla is found on a nearby page. Upon reconvening, the leader makes a short address on the golden text, also in Tsimshian. Another hymn is sung in English, and the meeting closes with prayer by one of the other elders, only to be reconvened again in a few minutes for what is called the Young People's Gospel Hymn Song Service. And now the Tsimshian love of song and music has a feast. It is most edifying to see with what vim and feeling they sing, one after the other, their favorite gospel hymns. and at almost every service a new one is added to the list, which makes their hearts swell and their voices rise mightily to the throne of God in song and praise. At 7:30 the church bell again calls these devoted people, this time to the evening service, at which there is the singing of a hymn in English, a prayer by Mr. Duncan in Tsimshian, and a short address in the same language on some subject selected by him from the Scriptures. Then the doxology is sung, and one of the elders, selected for that purpose, while all the congregation is kneeling, from his pew leads in a closing prayer. The congregation solemnly and reverently disperses, and the Sabbath at Metlakahtla is over. Later on, one hears the organs in the different houses and gospel hymns continue to be sung in the homes until 10 o'clock, which is the recognized hour of rest in the village. On Sunday evenings, Mr. Duncan generally takes up a series of discourses. The summer of 1908, it was the parables which furnished the theme. On Wednesday evening is held the midweek service, attended by all of the more earnest Christians at the place. For of course there are here, as everywhere, those who are more earnest in their Christian life and those who are lagging behind. It lasts about an hour, and is opened with one of the old, well-known hymns in English. A short prayer and address in Tsimshian follow, then the closing prayer by one of the natives. For a couple of years, the epistles of St. Peter were taken up at these meetings, then the Psalms. In the year 1908, the miracles of Christ furnished the subject for devotional consideration. Mr. Duncan has never, at any time, made any translation of the Bible, or any part of it, into their language. He has such pious veneration for the old King James Version that he can only think of an attempt to transfer it into their tongue as an absolute mutilation of the Holy Word. Bishop Ridley, at an early day, with the assistance of a female native, made a rather abortive attempt at translating into Tsimshian the Book of Common Prayer, but Mr. Duncan claims that the translation is more than useless. Half of the time it is absolutely meaningless to the Tsimshians, and what they can understand of it partakes rather of the ridiculous than of the sublime, in its awkward expressions of the holy thoughts. Several natives at Metlakahtla, who have tried to use the book, fully agree with him in his views in this regard. Anyone looking at the illustration on a nearby page of the interior of the church at Metlakahtla will undoubtedly believe that the large book above the preaching platform, inscribed Holy Bible, is carved in wood. From whatever point in the pews it is looked at, it has all the appearance of a book perfectly carved in wood. But this is an optical illusion, caused by the native painter's art, and makes it really a greater work of art than if it had been carved, for it is nothing but a flat piece of board, properly painted and shaded. The paintings in the two fields of the front wall, like everything in the church, except the pipe organ and the gas fixtures, are the work of the natives. One depicts the announcement of the angels to the shepherds at Bethlehem of the joyous event of the birth of the Christ. The other, the visit of the Magi to the Christ-child. In the background, bathed in the rays of the star, loom up the walls and the houses of the little city of Bethlehem. It should be noted that neither of the natives who had produced these works have had any instruction in painting, or, for that, in drawing. Their handiwork is simply the result of raw native talent. The inlaid work on the pulpit is very tasteful. In the rear of the church, near the entrance door, is fastened on the wall a memorial tablet in polished marble, recording the loss to the church of David Leask, for many years one of its elders, and already frequently mentioned in these pages as one of Mr. Duncan's most valued assistants among the natives. Undoubtedly, it will be interesting to see what stand Mr. Duncan and his church now take on the administration of the two sacraments, so long the subject of vital difference between him and the Society. As I have felt that on this subject I should, if possible, secure Mr. Duncan's views in his own language, I some time ago wrote and asked him to give them to me, and I here reproduce his answer to my letter, prefacing it, however, with the remark that some short time after removing to American Alaska, when he thought the people had attained the proper understanding of its importance, he introduced among them the sacrament of the Lord's Supper in the modified form in which it is now administered, and that he invariably uses the unfermented wine. It may here be stated that the main reason why he never would consent to the administration of this sacrament among the natives, under the form and ritual prescribed by the Anglican Church, and by a priest arrayed in his robes and vestments, was that he was afraid, and certainly not without good reason, that it would too much partake of and remind the Indians of the powers and practices of their old medicine men, who, apparelled in their blankets, were nothing but ordinary men with ordinary power, but upon assuming their robes, headdresses, necklaces, and rattles, became in the Indian mind endowed with superhuman, miraculous ability. Mr. Duncan says, "As I believe that faith in Christ should precede baptism, and as there is no definite command or warrant to baptize children, we do not have infant baptism. I know that some good people regard the ceremony of infant baptism as an act of dedicating their children to God. To this I reply, we can dedicate assuredly to God what will obey our will, but not that which can resist our will, having a will of its own. King David of old could and did dedicate his gold to God, and the gold was used for God's temple. But if he ever undertook to dedicate Absalom to God, he lived to see and mourn over his failure. Each individual has a will, which none, not even the father or mother, can command, but only the possessor, and without the exercise of that will, religious service is but mockery. What, however, can we do for children, is what was done for the children who were brought to Christ and received his blessing. The disciples at that time were baptizing more people than John the Baptist, we are told. But surely, if children were being admitted, as well as adults, the disciples would not have been guilty of the mistake they made when they rebuked those who brought the children. We too can bring children to Christ for his blessing, for he is present now with his church, where 2 or 3 are met together in his name, and this we do at Metlakahtla. Generally, on the first Sunday of the year, the parents, after a meeting with me in which the importance of this step is impressed on them, bring those of their children born during the past year to church at our morning service. A special prayer is offered to God in behalf of these little ones, and each child thereupon receives a card to commemorate the occasion, as follows. Our Lord Jesus Christ said, "Suffer little children to come unto me. You, blank, when an infant, were brought into the church at Metlakahtla, Alaska, on the day of, blank, A.D. 1900, blank, and a prayer was offered on your behalf. Remember this as you grow in years, and follow on to know the Lord Jesus Christ, whom to know is life eternal." When the children arrive at maturity, a class of catechumens is started, in which they are especially instructed in the essential truths of Christ's religion, and their duty to accept him and join the church by baptism, impressed upon them, whereupon those who desire to be are baptized. When I, while in British Columbia, objected to the administration of the Lord's Supper to the natives, one of the reasons was that I felt persuaded that the man-made additions to the ordinance which the ritual of the church imposed would mislead and prove to be a curse rather than a blessing to the natives in their infantile condition as Christians. I cannot shut my eyes to the sad fact that out of and around the administration of the sacrament, not out of the partaking of it, have arisen the greatest errors and the bitterest strife which have cursed and torn the Christian church. And I did not want to see these errors springing up in Metlakahtla, while I had influence to keep them out. After the settlement of our people in Alaska, we added this Christian ordinance to our church service, but we keep it in the simplicity of its inauguration. I recognize the ordinance to be simply a memorial, and Christians are to partake of it, but I see no authority for it to be administered by a priest. We have a very solemn and simple service. After my address to the people on some scripture bearing on the service, I step down and take my seat among the congregation. 4 elders then go to the table, and while they stand before it, I read the words from the scripture which our Lord used when he instituted the ordinance. The elders then take plates of bread and hand them to the communicants, where they are seated. After the bread is received, each communicant kneels in silent prayer. The wine, in 4 vessels, is dealt with in the same way. When all have partaken in this way, I resume my place at the desk, and we join in a hymn of praise, and this is followed by prayer by one of the elders. This takes place 3 times a year, only at evening service, to which none come but those who desire to participate in the communion service. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Grand Old Man. The fame of the mission of Metlakahtla has traveled all over Alaska, and it is now generally recognized as the only successful missionary undertaking in all the great Northland. Even those in Alaska who have no use for churches and no faith in missionaries, priests, or ministers make an exception of Father Duncan, as he is generally called in the great Northwest. The roughest miner, the most godless gambler, the most arrant infidel will take his hat off to him. That is merely an evidence of the general respect with which a great, unselfish, but successful Christian man and his accomplishments inspire everybody, even though they be not believing Christians. If Mr. Duncan should be asked for his views as to why Metlakahtla has proven such a contrast to the pronounced failures surrounding it, he would undoubtedly, after having insisted on giving God the glory, first and last say, First, I have always from the first given these natives the gospel message in their own language. I would never speak to them either through an interrupter or in the trading jargon. Footnote. His way of spelling interpreter. End footnote. Second, I have kept out all sects and denominational rule. We are simply Christians, nothing else at Metlakahtla. The Word of God has united us, not split us up into parties, and we love and treat all evangelical Christians as our brethren. Third, by removing those who came under the influence of the gospel away from heathen and bad white influences, and by, as much as possible, keeping them and their children uncontaminated by bad associations. To this I would like to add a further reason for the success of Metlakahtla, viz., fourth, the combination so rare that it becomes almost miraculous of an excellent Christian preacher filled with the Holy Ghost and a first-class practical businessman in the person of the missionary in charge. Mr. Duncan has, naturally, after his sad experience, no use for missionary societies or missionary boards. According to his idea, successful missions fostered under their care come to exist not propter hoc, nor even post hoc, but in spite of hoc. His conception of an ideal mission is one conducted by a practical, God-fearing missionary, selected from the midst of a Christian congregation and supported by it, or, at the most, by 2 or 3 congregations who conclude to do this work together. He thinks that with direct communication thus continuously existing between the congregation, and preferably between individual members of it, and the missionary, far better results will be obtained than by the present complex machinery, which naturally has a tendency to foster a spirit of intervention, dictatorialness, and short authority in the executive board, which must have anything but a healthy effect on the growth of a Christian mission. Some way or another, Mr. Duncan always makes me think of Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles. Not only in his mental makeup and splendid determination, but in his appearance, there is something that reminds me of the picture I carry in my mind of the great apostle. Short of stature, stocky, a strong bald head, a full white beard, sparkling bright blue eyes, and ruddy cheeks, like a bonny country lassie. There is such a virility, such courage, and such youthful power emanating from him, that it seems almost incredible that the snows of 76 winters have fallen on his devoted head. When you observe the erect carriage, the elastic step, the almost electric activity, And when the fire of the sparkling, laughing eyes lights yours, and you hear the sonorous, persuasive voice relating some interesting incident in his wonderful life, you simply refuse to believe that any more than, at the outside, 50 years can have been, so far, the span of his life. You fully believe him when he tells you that he has never been sick in bed for a day in his long life. He is indeed a walking evangel of the simple life, and shows it in every feature. No one who has enjoyed the privilege of sitting under the spell of his conversational powers will ever be able to forget the impression made upon him. And if that is the case with us, who have only heard him converse in English, what must it be to those who can understandingly listen when he converses in Tsimshian, the language in which he himself says he both thinks and dreams? His great kindness is writ in large letters all over his face, and the glad smiles of the children of Metlakahtla, when they come into the sunshine of his eyes, bear witness to it. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace tell me that during the 10 years they have lived with him as everyday companions, year in and year out, he has never spoken a cross word. A man with a temper as sweet as that ought to be married, but he has thought otherwise, and is a confirmed old bachelor. One evening, 4 years ago, as we sat one moonlit night on the veranda, and a spell of reminiscence came over him, I suppose, he said that if any one, when he was 20 years of age or so, should have told him that he would live his life as an old bachelor and never get married, he would have laughed heartily at their ignorance. I had my friends and acquaintances among the young ladies, he said, and while I probably never was what you would call really in love, there were some I liked very well indeed. I always enjoyed ladies' society, and do to this day. During the first 10 or even 20 years of my sojourn among the Indians, my friends in Victoria were very busy trying to find a helpmate for me. Some of them even went so far as to send ladies, whom they wanted me to marry, on trips up the coast. But while I, of course, appreciated their kindness, I would much have preferred to make my own choice, if I had felt so inclined. After a short silence, I even had a love letter once. Would you believe it? A lady in Victoria wrote me that she had admired me from the first day she had heard of my work, and still more so after she met me, and that she gladly would have become my wife, and joined me in my work, had I asked her, but that I never asked. That she, before she on the morrow was to become another honourable man's wife, thought she would close these pages of her life by telling me what her feelings had been. And she was no old maid neither, he added with a humorous twinkle in his eye. She was a fine-looking young girl, and a very good woman. I guess she wanted me to know what I had missed. Would you mind telling me the real reason you never married, I asked. Was it not because your experience with Mrs. Tugwell, the first lady missionary sent out to you, prejudiced you against all women? Oh no, he said. I had better sense than that. I knew very well there were a few of them who could make biscuits. But I made up my mind that I could not conscientiously ask any refined woman to come up and share my lonely life among the Indians, hundreds of miles from all the comforts of life. I knew well enough that I could ask no one else to make the sacrifice I made. I knew that nothing would have been so precious to me as human sympathy and interest in my work, no greater help to me than to have some one share my sorrows and troubles, as well as my joys and my glorious experiences. But I also knew that what was promised in enthusiasm might be rued after years of hard trial, and that the time might come when I might be compelled to give up my life work at the solicitation of a wife who had become tired of the tribulations of a career among the Indians. In brief, I made up my mind that my life work was of greater importance to me than domestic happiness, and so I pursued my solitude. And still I am wrong in calling it solitude. God was with me. Do you know, when I returned to England in 1885 and met an agnostic who expressed doubt about God's existence, I said to him, "Sir, do not talk that way to me. I have been in God's presence during my solitude among the savages. There have been times when I felt God's very presence, when it seemed to me that I even saw his face." And as Mr. Duncan's eyes glowed when he said it, and as his face shone in the moonlight, I really believed that he had. I thought I could see in it the reflection of Yahweh's glory. Like every old bachelor, of course, Mr. Duncan has his peculiarities. Thus he allows no person to come into his bedroom. For these many years he has persisted in making his own bed, and himself takes care of his immediate belongings. Even his office must be free from female interference. It is only on rare occasions, when he has been away, perhaps once every 4 or 5 years, that Mrs. Wallace has had the privilege of dusting and cleaning it, and putting things in order. But after such a house cleaning, it takes him quite a while until he gets everything back into that beautiful disorder, the mixture on the floor and chairs, and shelves and tables, of books and boxes and papers and letters, which enables him to find anything he wants when he wants it, because he remembers just where he put it, and how many other layers have been placed above it, for he has a memory which seems almost superhuman. He not only practically knows the whole Bible by heart, but he can reel off whole sentences from books that he has read perhaps years ago, and recite hymns and songs at pleasure. Names of the most insignificant person whom he has met once in his life 40, 50, or even 60 years ago seem to come as readily to his tongue as if they were impressed on his mind but yesterday. One day, some 3 years ago, I stood near him on the dock at Metlakahtla, as the Spokane, with a large number of excursionists, was about getting away. A kind-hearted, elderly lady, who had shown great interest in the work, asked him, "What have you done about a successor? What is to become of this glorious work when you die?" He did not answer in words. The index finger of his right hand was lifted on high, pointing up into the sky above. It was not done for effect. I saw a glorious ray of faith in his eye. I then believed that God would provide. I still so believe. And yet I betray no professional secret, for Mr. Duncan has himself spoken of it to the Indians, when I say that he has, to my knowledge, in his will provided that all he owns in the world is after his death to go into the hands of 3 intimate friends, to be by them held in trust for the benefit of the Indians, for the purpose of maintaining among them the same Christian work, in the same spirit as it has by him been carried on. We all hope and trust, however, that God will give him many years of life and of work to his glory yet. But when the time comes, when his life work shall be ended, and God the Almighty Father shall want him to come home, I hope it will be to his good fortune to look for the last time into the indescribably rich beauty of a glorious Alaska sunset, and that the Lord of hosts, as he took Elijah of old, will send down his chariot of fire, in which to take to the paradise of the Christ, above the sunlit clouds, his venerable, lovable servant, William Duncan, the Apostle of Alaska. End of chapter 42. End of the Apostle of Alaska. The Story of William Duncan of Metlakahtla by John W. ARCTANDER.